Tonight, we're exploring the complete history of Pokémon's forgotten gods. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Before there were gym badges, before there were regions, and long before the first human ever threw a Pokeball, there was a void. We often think of the Pokémon world as a place of science and discovery, a place where professors study biology and trainers measure power in statistics. But beneath that modern surface lies a foundation of ancient terror, celestial architecture, and divine entities that have been slowly erased from the public consciousness. We call them legendaries. We call them mythicals. But to the ancients who carved their likenesses into stone and built temples in their honor, they were simply gods. The story of these beings is not a single clean narrative. It is a messy, layered history of myths that have been buried by time, rewritten by new civilizations, and occasionally rediscovered by a child with a sense of wonder. From the silent egg-shaped origin of the universe to the sealed chambers deep beneath the earth, where giants wait in a slumber that spans millennia, the theology of this world is as vast as the cosmos itself. Imagine, for a moment, standing on the peak of Mount Coronet in a time before cities. The air is thin, the wind is howling, and the very fabric of reality feels brittle. To the people of that era, the sky wasn't just a blue expanse. It was the domain of a being that could weave time like thread, and a creature that could fold space like paper. They lived in a world where the ground beneath their feet wasn't just dirt and rock, but the literal body of a titan that had dragged the continents into place with ropes. This wasn't just folklore to them, it was the fundamental truth of their existence. But as the centuries passed, these truths became legends. Legends became fairy tales. And eventually, fairy tales became the flavor text of a Pokédex entry that most modern trainers barely glance at. We have forgotten the weight of these beings. We have forgotten that when Groudon and Kyogre clashed, it wasn't a battle for sport, it was a cataclysm that reshaped the map of the world. We have forgotten that the laughter of a spirit in a forest could mean the difference between a season of harvest or a century of famine. Tonight we are going to peel back those layers of modernization. We are going to look at the original one, the entity that breathed life into the chaos, and the trio of dragons that represent the very dimensions we inhabit. We will travel to the Johto region, where religion and tradition still hold a flickering candle to the majestic birds of the sky and the beasts born from the ashes of a tragic fire. We will descend into the ruins of Hoenn to find the forgotten golems, and we will walk through the tall grass of Alola to seek the protection of guardians who have watched over their islands since the dawn of man. Why does this matter? Because the history of these forgotten gods is the history of the Pokémon world itself. It explains why the geography looks the way it does, why certain cultures hold specific values, and why there is a lingering sense of mystery every time we step into a dark cave or an ancient forest. These aren't just powerful monsters to be captured and traded. They are the pillars of reality, and in many cases, they are still watching us, waiting in the distortion, sleeping in the sea, or drifting through the stars, indifferent to our technology, but essential to our survival. As we journey through the chronology of creation, from the primordial egg to the ruinous treasures sealed away for their sins, I want you to let the scale of this history wash over you. The timeline we are about to traverse spans billions of years. We will see the rise and fall of empires that tried to harness divine power, and we will see the quiet, humble ways that these gods still manifest in the modern day. The mystery at the heart of it all is simple. If these beings truly created everything we see, why have they allowed themselves to be forgotten? Why do they hide in the tall grass? Why do they wait for a worthy soul to find them? Perhaps they are not waiting to be caught, but waiting to be understood. Perhaps the gods of the Pokémon world are not looking for worship, but for a connection that transcends the boundaries of human and divine. So, settle in. Let the world outside fade away. We are going back to the beginning, to the moment the first heartbeat echoed in the silence of the void. We are going to find the pieces of a broken history and put them back together, one myth at a time. This is the story of the powers that shaped the world, the spirits that protect it, and the forgotten gods who still haunt the edges of our maps. When the Pokémon franchise first arrived in 1996, Its world felt grounded in a way that seems almost strange to look back on now. There were no creation myths whispered in ancient libraries, no temples dedicated to cosmic beings, no clans debating the will of a divine Pokémon. Instead, the Kanto region presented itself as a place of science, of technology, of progress. The player character was a young trainer setting out on a journey that felt less like a mythic quest and more like a summer adventure, complete with bicycles, Pokeballs, and a rival who was more annoying than ominous. And in this world, the most powerful creatures were not gods. They were simply the strongest, the rarest, the most elusive. But the silence surrounding Theology in those early games was not an absence of meaning. It was the quiet before everything changed. Consider the original 151 Pokémon. Among them, Mew was the most mysterious, but its mystery was framed entirely through the lens of biology and genetics. The Pokédex described it as the ancestor of all Pokémon, a creature so rare that only a handful of scientists even believed it existed. Its DNA contained the genetic code of every Pokémon that would ever live, making it a living blueprint, a primordial source code written in the language of evolution. This was not the language of worship. This was the language of a laboratory. Mew was not a deity to be prayed to. It was a specimen to be studied, a missing link in the chain of life that connected every species in the world. The mystery of Mew was not theological. It was scientific, and that distinction is crucial to understanding why the early games felt so different from what came later. The absence of overt religion in Kanto was not a flaw. It was a deliberate choice that established a foundation of realism, a world where power was measured in gym badges and tight matchups, not in divine favour. The legendary birds Takuno, Zapdos and Moltres were rare and powerful, but they were not worshipped. They were simply ancient Pokémon that lived in remote locations, waiting to be captured by a trainer skilled enough to reach them. Mewtwo, the most powerful Pokémon in the original games, was not a gift from the heavens. It was a creation of human ambition, a genetically engineered being born from the DNA of Mew, and the hubris of scientists who thought they could play God. And that contrast is the first hint of a theme that would define the entire franchise. Mewtwo was man-made, a product of science and violence, while Mew was natural, ancient, and elusive. But neither was a god. They were two sides of the same coin, one representing the potential of nature, the other representing the danger of tampering with it. This thematic contrast between the man-made Mewtwo and the natural gods of later generations is one of the most fascinating threads in Pokémon lore. In Kanto, the most powerful being was born in a laboratory, a creature of rage and isolation that had no connection to any mythic tradition. It was a warning about the consequences of unchecked ambition, not a figure of reverence. Compare that to the beings that would follow. Arceus, the creator of the universe. Dialga and Palkia, the masters of time and space. Ho-Oh, the bringer of resurrection and renewal. These later Pokémon were not created by humans. They existed before humans, and in many cases, they existed before the world itself. The shift from a scientific origin story to a mythological one is not just a change in tone. It is a fundamental reimagining of what Pokémon can be. And yet, the seeds of that mythology were already present in Kanto, hidden in plain sight. The Pokémon world was not entirely devoid of mystery. The existence of Mew, with its genetic connection to all life, implied a deeper history that the games never fully explored. The ruins of ancient civilizations, like the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, hinted at a past that was older and stranger than the modern world of Pokémon battles and Pokeballs. But these hints were just that, hints. They were not developed into full mythologies because the franchise was still finding its voice. The creators were not yet ready to ask the big questions about creation, divinity, and the nature of reality. They were content to let the world be a place of adventure and discovery, where the greatest mysteries were solved by catching them in a Pokeball. But that silence could not last forever. The success of the first generation gave the developers the freedom to expand, to ask deeper questions, and to build a world that felt more ancient and more sacred. The absence of religion in the early games set the stage for the massive lore expansions to follow because it created a vacuum. The world of Kanto was a blank slate, a canvas that had been painted with the colours of science and progress. But the underlying structure was waiting for something more. And when the second generation arrived, that silence was broken by the sound of a burning tower and the cry of a phoenix rising from the ashes. The transition from Kanto to Johto is one of the most important shifts in Pokémon history, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of worldview. Johto is a region steeped in tradition, where ancient customs are still practiced, where the past is not forgotten, but preserved in ritual and dance. And at the heart of Johto's mythology lies the story of the Burned Tower, a place where 3 Pokémon died in a fire and were resurrected by the legendary Ho-Oh. This is not a scientific origin story. This is a miracle, a moment of divine intervention that transformed death into life and created the legendary beasts Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. The silence of Kanto was replaced by the thunder of a mythic event that would echo through every generation that followed. And that is where we will go next. The story of the Burned Tower, the resurrection of the legendary beasts, and the emergence of a world where gods are not just powerful, but sacred. The silence before the storm is over. The storm is about to break over Ecruteak City. Kanto, as we discussed, was a world where power was something to be captured, catalogued, and studied under a microscope. Mew was a ghost in the genetic code, a whisper of ancestry rather than a prayer on the lips of the faithful. But as we leave that sterile laboratory and cross the sea to the west, the air changes. It grows thick with incense and the weight of centuries. In Johto, the past is not dead, it is not even past. It is danced in the streets, whispered in the rustle of silk kimonos, and carved into the very foundations of its oldest city. This is where Pokémon myth becomes something you can touch, something you can mourn. This is the story of the resurrection at Ecruteak. To understand this shift, you have to stand, at least in your mind, at the base of the Burned Tower. It is a skeletal structure, a blackened ribcage of stone against the sky. The people of Ecruteak call it the Brass Tower, a name that speaks to a time before the fire, a time of gleaming metal and sacred purpose. It was built, the legends say, as a meeting place between humans and the Great Sky Guardians. For centuries it stood as a pillar of the world, a place where the earthly and the divine could touch. But then came the lightning, or perhaps it was a stray ember from a human quarrel. The records are silent on the cause, but the effect is undeniable. A fire of such ferocity swept through the tower that the brass itself seemed to weep and melt, and in that inferno 3 nameless Pokémon perished. This is the tragedy that births the Johto mythos. It is not a story of a god creating the world from nothing. It is a story of a god finding death and refusing to accept it. For 9 days and 9 nights the tower smouldered. The people of Ecruteak wept for the loss, not just of the structure, but of the sacred presence that had blessed their city. And then, on the 10th day, a rainbow appeared. It did not arc across the sky like a normal rainbow. It descended. It touched the blackened heart of the tower, and from that pillar of light emerged Ho-Oh. Ho-Oh is the first Pokémon we encounter that is treated not as a powerful animal, but as a ritualistic force, a bringer of life where life had been extinguished. It is a phoenix, but not in the simple sense of rising from ashes. Ho-Oh did not rise from the ashes of the tower, it descended into them. It looked upon the 3 charred bodies, and it did not weep. It breathed, and in that breath it did not simply heal, it transformed. It took the essence of what those 3 Pokémon had been, their souls, their courage, their loyalty, and it forged them into new forms. It created the legendary beasts. Raikou, born from the lightning that struck the tower, its fur crackling with the storm of that fateful night. Entei, born from the heat of the grief and power. And Suicune, born from the rain that finally quenched the flames, a creature of pure, flowing grace. The embodiment of the cleansing aftermath. This is not a myth of destruction, it's a myth of deliberate, intentional creation. Ho is not a god of random mercy. It is a god of ritual. It saw an ending and chose to write a new beginning. And this is the cultural shift that defines Johto. In Kanto, Pokémon were tools for battle, partners for adventure, subjects for science. In Johto, they are objects of veneration. They are living history. The people do not simply catch a Raikou. They understand that they are encountering a fragment of a sacred event, a piece of the tower's soul that still runs wild in the world. And this reverence is not just a passive belief. It is an active, living practice. You can see it in the kimono girls of Ecruteak City. These women are not just performers. They are the keepers of the flame, the preservers of the divine history. Their dances are not entertainment. They are oral tradition made physical. Every turn of the wrist, every sweep of the kimono sleeve, every step that echoes on the wooden stage is a retelling of the story of the tower. They dance the fire. They dance the rain. They dance the arrival of Ho-Oh, and in that dance the myth is not remembered. It is re-experienced. The audience is not watching a story about the past, they are witnessing the past become present. The Kimono Girls are the living link between the time of the brass tower and the time of the trainers who walk the streets today. They ensure that Ho-Oh is never truly forgotten, that the legendary beasts are never just data in a Pokédex. But there is another figure in this myth, one who stands in the shadow of the rainbow, Lugia. The Silver Wing. While Ho-Oh is the bringer of life, Lugia is the guardian of the deep. The stories say that Lugia once roosted atop the brass tower, alongside Ho-Oh, a pair of divine sentinels watching over the land. But when the fire came, when the 3 Pokémon died, Lugia did not stay to witness the resurrection. It fled. It retreated to the depths of the Whirl Islands, to a place where the light of the sun barely reaches, where the pressure of the ocean is a constant crushing weight. Some say it fled in grief. Others say it fled in shame, that it could not bear to see the destruction it failed to prevent. But there is a darker possibility. Perhaps Lugia fled because it knew something that Ho-Oh did not. Perhaps it understood that the resurrection, for all its beauty, was a disruption of a natural order. That by creating the legendary beasts, Ho-Oh had set in motion a chain of events that would echo for millennia. And so Lugia waits. It waits in the deep, its silver wing folded, its eyes closed, listening to the currents of the world, ready to emerge when the balance is once again threatened. This is the duality of Johto's divine mythology. Ho-Oh is the god of the surface, of light, of rebirth, of the visible miracle. Lugia is the god of the depths, of shadow, of preservation, of the hidden truth. One is celebrated in dance and song. The other is whispered about in the hushed tones of sailors who have seen too much. And as we prepare to leave the charred stones of Ecruteak behind, we must ask ourselves, what happens when the hidden truth finally rises from the deep? What happens when the silver wing unfurls and the storm begins? That is the story we will follow next, as we descend into the darkness of the Whirl Islands and confront the god who chose to look away. And yet, for all the light and resurrection that Ho-Oh brought to Ecruteak, there is an essence in Johto's mythology, one that chose the opposite path, where Ho-Oh ascended into visibility, becoming a symbol of hope and renewal that could be seen in the counterpart retreated into the story of the Silver Wing and the depths it guards. The Whirl Islands are not merely a geographic curiosity off the coast of Olivine City. They are a sacred barrier, a labyrinth of sea cave and churning currents that have kept something hidden for centuries. Local sailors speak with a reverence that borders on fear, telling stories of sudden storms that rise without warning, of waters that seem to pull ships toward the archipelago rather than push them away. And at the heart of this natural fortress, in the deepest chamber where the sunlight barely penetrates, dwells Lugia. To understand why Lugia retreated here, we must return to the tragedy of the brass tower. When the lightning struck and the flames consumed the tower, 3 Pokémon perished. But the disaster did not only affect the tower itself. The shockwave of that event, the spiritual rupture it caused, rippled outward through the fabric of Johto's mythic landscape. Ho-Oh responded by descending to resurrect the fallen, to bring life from death. Lugia responded differently. It fled. The lore suggests that Lugia was once associated with the brass tower, as well perhaps as a counterpart guardian, a silver shadow to Ho-Oh's golden light. But after the fire, something broke. Lugia did not simply relocate, it withdrew from the world of humans entirely. It chose the Whirl Islands not just as a home, but as a prison, a place where it could control the storms that raged within it. The sea became its sanctuary, and the storms became its shield. This is where we begin to see the hidden hierarchy of the Johto birds, a structure that is never explicitly stated in the games, but is whispered in the architecture of the myth itself. Ho-Oh is the visible divinity, the god you can pray to, the one whose feathers are said to bring happiness. Lugia is the hidden god, the one you feel rather than see, the presence in the depths that controls the weather and the tides. If Ho-Oh represents the sky and the sun, Lugia represents the sea and the moon. The forces that operate beneath the surface, invisible but undeniable. The connection between the sea and the moon is ancient in human mythology, and Pokémon lore taps into this same well. The tides are pulled by the moon, and the storms are born from the interaction of sea and sky. Lugia, as the guardian of the storms, sits at this intersection. It is not a god of destruction, but a god of balance, a force that keeps the volatile energies of the natural world in check. Its retreat to the Whirl Islands was not an act of cowardice, but of responsibility. It removed itself from human affairs so that it could focus on its true duty, maintaining the equilibrium of the deep. And this is what makes Lugia so fascinating in the context of Forgotten Gods. It is not forgotten because no one remembers it. It's forgotten because it chose to be hidden. The people of Johto know Lugia exists, but they do not worship it in the same way they revere Ho-Oh. There are no kimono girls dancing for Lugia, no rituals performed in its honor. Instead, there is a quiet acknowledgement, a respectful distance. The Whirl Islands are avoided, not because the people fear punishment, but because they understand that some powers are not meant to be disturbed. This brings us to the deeper truth about Johto itself. It is the most lived-in religion in the Pokémon world, not because it has the most elaborate temples or the most dramatic myths, but because its beliefs are woven into the daily lives of its people. The burned tower is not a museum piece, it is a scar on the landscape that still bleeds memory. The kimono girls perform dances that have been passed down for generations, not as tourist attractions, but as acts of preservation. The legendary beasts roam the region, not as distant legends, but as living reminders of Ho-Oh's mercy. And Lugia sleeps beneath the waves, a constant presence that the sailors feel every time they cast their nets. This is what makes Johto unique. Its gods are not confined to ancient texts or sealed away in ruins. They are active participants in the world, even if their participation is subtle. Ho may be seen once in a blue moon, but its influence is felt in every rainbow. Lugia may never surface, but its storms shape the coastline. The religion of Johto is not a set of beliefs to be studied. It is a relationship to be lived. And yet, even in this living religion, there are layers that have been forgotten. The hierarchy of the Johto birds, for instance, hints at a larger cosmic order that has been lost to time. Why did Lugia retreat while Ho-Oh remained? What was the original relationship between these two beings before the fire? And what of the third tower that once stood in Ecruteak, the one that was never rebuilt? These questions linger in the margins of the myth, suggesting that the story we know is only a fragment of a larger narrative. The silver wing, the item that allows a trainer to summon Lugia, is itself a symbol of this hidden knowledge. It is not a feather that falls from the sky, but an artifact that must be sought, a key to a door that most people do not even know exists. To obtain the silver wing is to acknowledge that there is more to the world than what is visible, that the deep holds secrets that the surface cannot contain. As we prepare to leave Johto and its living mythology behind, we must carry this understanding with us. The gods of this region are not forgotten because they are weak or irrelevant. They are forgotten because they have chosen their domains, and those domains do not always include the world of humans. But the next region we will explore, Hoenn, tells a different story. There the gods have not retreated. They have been sealed, buried beneath the earth and beneath the waves, waiting for the moment when the ancient powers will rise again. This is the story of primordial scars of Hoenn, where the forgotten gods are not hiding, but sleeping, and their awakening will reshape the world. From the depths of the Whirl Islands, where Lugia's shadow still lingers, it now sails south across the open sea, toward a land where the earth itself remembers violence. Hoenn is not a region built on gentle hills and quiet forests. It is a land of volcanic ridges, sunken caverns, and ocean trenches so deep that light has never touched their floors. And if you listen to the oldest stories, you will hear that the ground beneath your feet and the waves that crash against the shore are not natural at all. They are scars. They are the wounds left behind by gods who do not sleep peacefully. In Hoenn, the myths do not speak of resurrection or ritual dances. They speak of awakening. And when something awakens here, it does not bless the land. It tears it apart. Let us begin with the simplest truth. Groudon and Kyogre are not gods in the way that Ho-Oh is a god. They are not beings to be worshipped or appeased with offerings. They are forces, tectonic and oceanic. They are the planet's rage given form. When Groudon stirs, the continents groan. When Kyogre rises, the sea remembers that it once covered everything. These are not creatures that descended from the sky to guide humanity. They are the planet's oldest instincts, buried deep in the mantle and the abyss, waiting for the moment when the balance tips too far. And the people of Hoenn know this. They do not build temples to Groudon or Kyogre. They do not leave offerings at their shrines. Instead, they study them. They map the fault lines. They measure the rising tides. They treat their legends not as sacred stories, but as warnings written in stone and salt water. In Hoenn, myth has become geology. The old tales are preserved in museums and excavation sites, not in hymns. The gods are not forgotten because nobody remembers them. They are forgotten because the people have chosen to remember them as disasters rather than deities. It is a subtle but profound shift. In Yoto, you pray to Ho-Oh for renewal. In Hoenn, you watch the seismographs for the first tremor. This attitude did not emerge from nowhere. It was born from the Great Calamity, an event so devastating that it reshaped not only the land but the collective memory of an entire civilization. The details are sparse, buried beneath layers of time and ash, but the core of the story survives in the oral traditions of Sutopolis. That city, built within the crater of a dormant volcano, is the keeper of the memory. The people of Sutopolis do not merely live on the water, they live inside the wound. Their ancestors witnessed the awakening. They saw the land rise and the sea boil. They watched as Groudon and Kyogre clashed, each expansion of their power threatening to crack the world open like an egg. And they survived, not through divine intervention, but through the intervention of something else, something that came from above. Rayquaza, the sky serpent, the celestial mediator. In the mythology of Hoenn, Rayquaza is not a creator, it is not a destroyer, it is the third point of a triangle that keeps the other two from collapsing into each other. While Groudon expands the land and Kyogre deepens the sea, Rayquaza patrols the boundary between them. It is the atmosphere, it is the ozone layer, it is the invisible membrane that holds the planet together. When the Calamity reached its peak, when Groudon and Kyogre had pushed the world to the brink of fracture, it was Rayquaza that descended from the heavens and forced them back into dormancy. It did not kill them. It did not banish them to another dimension. It simply reminded them that there is a limit to their power, and that limit is written in the sky. The people of Sutopolis remember this. They pass down the story not as a legend of heroes, but as a record of survival. They know that the gods are not gone. They are merely sleeping, and they know that the only thing preventing another calamity is the silent vigilance of Rayquaza, circling high above the clouds, watching for the moment when the earth and sea begin to stir again. But here is the question that lingers in the dark corners of Hoenn's caves and the deepest trenches of its oceans. What happens if Rayquaza is not there? What happens if the mediator is absent or distracted, or simply too far away to intervene in time? The answer is written in the scars of the land itself. The answer is the reason why Hoenn does not build temples. Because when your gods are tectonic forces, you do not worship them, you prepare for them. You build your cities on high ground. You study the patterns of the earth. You teach your children to read the clouds and the tides. And you never, ever forget that the ground beneath your feet is not solid. It is waiting. And so as we leave Hoenn behind, we turn our attention to something else. Something older than the Weather Trio. Something that was not born from the planet's rage, but was built by hands that feared the same forces. In the frozen north, beneath layers of ice and stone, there are seals. There are doors that have not been opened in millennia, and behind those doors, something is waiting to be remembered. That is where our next chapter takes us, to the sealed giants. The previous chapter left us in Hoenn, where the earth itself seemed to breathe with the slumber of Groudon and Kyogre. Those were forces of nature, raw and untamed, but they were not hidden. They were dormant, waiting beneath the surface of the world. Their presence known to those who cared to look. But there is a different kind of power in the Pokémon world. One that was not merely left to sleep. It was deliberately, methodically, and fearfully sealed away. And the evidence of that sealing is not written in ancient scrolls or whispered in folk songs. It is carved into stone, in a language that predates the written word of any human civilization. It is a language of raised dots, a tactile script meant to be read by fingertips in the dark. It is Braille, and the messages it carries are not prayers, they are warnings. To understand the sealed giants, we must first understand the civilization that built their prisons. This was not a culture that worshipped these beings. They did not build temples in their honor or offer sacrifices to appease them. They built chambers, deep underground, reinforced with stone, and sealed with mechanisms that required precise knowledge to open. They did not want to be found. They wanted to ensure that no one, ever again, would stumble upon what they had buried. The Braille messages are not a guide for the faithful. They are a set of instructions for the foolish. They say, in effect, if you have come this far, you have already made a terrible mistake. Turn back. Do not proceed. Do not disturb the sleep of the giants. And the giants they feared were the Regis. Regirock, Regis, Registeel. These are not living creatures in the way we understand life. They are constructs, golems, bodies of ancient material, animated by a will that is not entirely their own. They are extensions of something greater. They are the fingers of a hand that once moved mountains. And the hand itself is Regigigas. The legend of Regigigas is one of the most terrifying in all of Pokémon mythology. It is said that this being pulled continents, that it tied ropes of energy to the very land masses of the world and dragged them into place. It shaped the geography of the planet. It moved mountains, carved valleys, and created the islands that would later become the regions we know. This is not a god of creation, in the sense of making something from nothing. This is a god of rearrangement, of brute force applied to the skeleton of the earth. It is a shaper, a mover, a being whose footsteps could cause earthquakes and whose breath could alter the climate. But then it disappeared, and the question that haunts the ruins is not where it went, but why it was sealed. The psychological impact of sealing a god rather than worshipping it is profound. Throughout human history, we have built religions around the forces we cannot control. We personify the storm, the sun, the harvest, and we offer our reverence in exchange for mercy. But the ancient civilization that dealt with Regigigas did not ask for mercy. They did not pray for it to spare them. They built a cage. They looked upon a being that could reshape continents and decided that it was too dangerous to exist in the world. They did not try to understand it. They did not try to befriend it. They tried to contain it, and they succeeded, at least for a time. But they knew that containment was not permanent. They knew that the seals would weaken, that the chambers would be found, that someone, someday would decode the Braille and make the choice to open the doors. And so they left their messages not as a blessing, but as a curse. The Braille says, "We have hidden this power because we could not destroy it." If you are reading this, you are about to release what we spent generations burying. You are about to wake the giant. The terrifying power of the Regis is not just in their strength, it is in their purpose. They are not random forces of destruction. They are guardian servants' keys. To release Regigigas, you must first prove yourself by capturing or defeating each of the 3 original Regis. You must demonstrate that you understand the mechanism, that you have the will to proceed. The ancient civilization designed a test. They wanted to ensure that only the most determined, the most knowledgeable, or the most reckless would ever reach the final chamber. And when you do, when you stand before the great golem that pulled the world into shape, you are not standing before a god that demands worship. You are standing before a prisoner that has been waiting for release. And that is the deepest fear embedded in the lore. The ancient people did not believe that Regigigas was evil. They believed it was indifferent. They believed that its power was so vast, so beyond human comprehension, that its mere existence in the world was a threat. It did not need to be malevolent to destroy them. It only needed to move. And so they buried it, not out of hatred, but out of terror. They sealed a god, because they could not afford to let it be free. The Braille messages are scattered across the ruins of Hoenn, and later, in other regions, they appear again. In the crown tundra of Galar, new Regis were discovered, Regi-Leki and Regidrago, and with them, more Braille, more warnings. The pattern is consistent. Every time humans have encountered these beings, they have chosen to seal them. It is not a regional tradition. It is a universal response. When you meet a Rigi, you do not build a temple, you build a lock. And Regigigas itself, the continental shifter, is the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It is a being that shaped the physical world before disappearing, and its disappearance was not a mystery. It was an engineering project. The ancient civilization dedicated itself to the task of removing this being from the world. They did not kill it. They could not. They could only hide it and hope that no one would ever find the key. But the key exists. The Braille exists. And in the games, we are the ones who decode it. We are the ones who choose to open the doors. We are the ones who stand before Regigigas and decide whether to capture it or let it sleep. The law does not judge us for that choice. It simply presents the consequence. The giant wakes and the world trembles. This is the legacy of the sealed giants. They are not forgotten because they were unimportant. They are forgotten because remembering them was too dangerous. Ancient civilization did not want their story to be told. They wanted the memory to fade, the ruins to crumble, the Braille to become unreadable. They wanted the giants to become myth, and then to become nothing at all. But the stone endures, the messages remain, and every time a trainer defices them, the seal is broken once more, and so we are left with a question that echoes through the ages. What do we do with a power we cannot control? Do we worship it, fear it, or bury it? The ancient civilization chose burial, but the earth has a way of giving up its secrets. And the next chapter of this story begins not with a giant, but with an egg that emerged from chaos itself, an egg that contained the original one. That is the story of the Egg of Chaos, and it is the story of how everything began. We left off standing in the shadow of Regigigas, sealed away beneath the ice of Snow Point Temple, its ancient power locked behind a language of dots and dashes carved into stone. That civilization, whoever they were, understood something we often forget. Some forces are not meant to be awakened. They built prisons, not shrines. They wrote warnings, not prayers. And yet, for all their caution, they only contained one piece of a much larger puzzle. Because the giants, the golems, the moving of continents, that was never the beginning. That was already a response to something older. Something that had already happened before the first stone was ever laid. To find the true origin, we have to go deeper. Not into a temple, not into a cave, but into a library. The Canalav Library in the heart of Sinnoh holds texts that predate any known civilization in the Pokémon world. These are not Pokédex entries. They are not folklore passed down by word of mouth. They are fragments of a creation myth so old that the people who wrote it down were already trying to understand something they could never have witnessed. And at the center of that myth is an egg. But not an egg like any you have ever seen. Not the egg of a Pokémon, not a fossil waiting to hatch. This egg emerged from absolute nothingness. A void so complete that even the concept of emptiness did not yet exist. There was no time, no space, no light, no dark, no up, no down. There was only chaos. And from that chaos, something stirred. A single point of awareness. A first thought. A being that had no name because there was no one to speak it. That being was Arceus. The texts describe it as the original one. It hatched from the egg of chaos, and in doing so, it became the first consciousness in a universe that had never known consciousness before. And here is where the story becomes something more than a simple creation myth. Because Arceus did not just exist, it acted. It looked out at the void, and it began to shape it. From its own being, it brought forth three entities, each one responsible for a fundamental pillar of reality. Dialtica to govern time, Palkia to govern space, and Giratina to govern the space between, the distortion that exists where reality breaks down. But why three? Why not one being to rule all? Because creation in this myth is not about control, it is about balance. Time and space are the stage on which everything happens, but without something to oppose them, without a shadow, without a counterweight, the stage would collapse into itself. Giratina is not evil. It is not a devil in the way we might understand from human religions. It is the necessary opposite, the force that ensures the universe does not become static, does not become a perfect, lifeless machine. And yet, for that very reason, it was cast out, exiled to a world of its own, a dimension of broken physics and impossible geometry, the distortion world, because even the original one understood that some forces are too dangerous to leave unchecked. This is where Generation 4 fundamentally rewrote the scale of the Pokémon universe. Before Sinnoh, the legends were regional. Ho-Oh was a powerful bird, but it did not create the fabric of existence. Groudon and Kyogre could reshape continents and seas, but they did not invent the concept of land or water. The creation trio changed everything. Suddenly, Pokémon were not just powerful creatures. They were the architects of reality itself. The very ground you stand on, the air you breathe, the passage of time you experience every second of every day, all of it was set in motion by beings you could theoretically capture in a Pokeball. That is a staggering shift in scale, and it raises questions that the games never fully answer. Questions about what it means to be a god in a world where gods can be commanded by a 10-year-old trainer. But the philosophical implications go even deeper, because if Arceus is the first cause, the unmoved mover, the being that set everything into motion, then what does that say about the nature of the Pokémon world itself? In our own world, the question of a first cause has occupied theologians and philosophers for millennia. Is there a prime mover, something that existed before everything else, that did not itself need a cause? In the Pokémon universe, that question has an answer. It is Arceus. And yet, the myth does not tell us where the egg came from. It says the egg emerged from chaos. But what is chaos? Is it a substance, a state of being, a remnant of an even older universe? The texts are silent. They leave that thread hanging, deliberately unresolved. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the myth is not meant to be a complete explanation. It is meant to be a foundation, a starting point from which all other stories can grow. The Lake Trio, Uxie, Mesprit and Azelf, they would come later, born from the same cosmic energy, tasked with giving the world knowledge, emotion and willpower. Without them, the universe would be a stage with no actors, a clockwork of time and space with no one to experience it. And that is the missing piece. Arceus created the structure, but the Lake Trio created the soul. They are the reason you can feel awe when you look up at the stars, the reason you can wonder about your own existence, the reason you are here, listening to this story, trying to understand something that was never meant to be fully understood. And yet, for all this cosmic grandeur, the myth of the original one is almost forgotten by the time of the modern games. Most people in Sinnoh have never read the Canalav texts. They know Dialga and Palkia as legends, but they do not worship them. They do not build temples in their honor. The Diamond and Pearl clans of Hisui, the ancient ancestors of Sinnoh's people, they remembered. They passed down the stories, generation after generation, until the memory became ritual, and the ritual became tradition, and the tradition became something distant, something that no one quite believed anymore. By the time we arrive in the present day, Arceus is a footnote, a myth within a myth, a god that even the gods themselves may have forgotten. But the egg remains, the chaos remains, and somewhere in the space between dimensions, in the distortion that Giratina calls home, the echoes of that first awakening still ripple outward, because creation is not a single event. It is not something that happened once and then stopped. It is ongoing. Every moment, every decision, every thought, it all feeds back into the chaos, reshaping the universe in ways too small to see. And that is the terrifying beauty of the original one's story. It is not over. It has never been over. The egg is still hatching. And that brings us to our next chapter, where we will look at the beings who inherited that creation and shaped it into the world we know, the architects of reality, Dialga, Palkia and the Shadow in the distortion. But that is a story for another night. For now, let the image of that first egg linger in your mind, a single point of light, emerging from nothing, carrying within it the seed of everything that would ever exist. And as you drift towards sleep, remember that you are part of that seed, part of the chaos, part of the egg, and the story is still unfolding. From that egg of chaos, from that first consciousness that willed itself into existence, the universe was not yet complete. Arceus had emerged, but a void is not a cosmos. A single point of light does not make a sky. What was needed were the architects, the beings who would take the raw potential of creation and give it form. And so, from Arceus, 3 entities were born, not as children, but as extensions of the original one's own will. Each one a fundamental law of reality given flesh and mind. The first of these was Dialga, and Dialga became the pillar of time. Not a keeper of a clock, not a guardian of a calendar, but time itself as a living force. Every moment that has ever passed, every second that has yet to occur, all of it flows through Dialga. To understand this is to understand why Dialga is not merely a powerful Pokémon, but a god in the truest sense. In Kanto, we had Mew, a creature of immense power, the ancestor of all life, but Mew was still a creature within the universe. Dialga is the universe. Without Dialga, there is no before, no after, no change, no decay, no growth. There is only an eternal frozen now. The very concept of a story, of a beginning and an end, only exists because Dialga allows it to. The second was Palkia, and Palkia became the pillar of space. Every inch of distance between every atom, every vast empty stretch between galaxies, every cramped corner of a cave, every horizon you have ever seen, all of it is Palkia. Space is not simply a container where things happen. Space is an active, living presence, and Palkia is its master. When you move your hand, you are not just moving flesh. You are negotiating with the fabric of existence itself. And Palkia is the authority that permits that negotiation. This is why these entities are considered gods, in a way that Kanto's legends never were. Mewtwo, for all its terrifying psychic might, was a weapon, a product of science and ambition. It could destroy a city, but it could not unmake the concept of distance. It could shatter a mountain, but it could not break the flow of time. Dialga and Palkia are not powerful within the world. They are the world. Now we must consider the place where these two forces meet, the point where the divine and the material intersect. This is the Spear Pillar, perched atop the highest peak of Mount Coronet. In the Sinnoh region, the Spear Pillar is not a temple built by human hands. It is a wound in reality, a place where the veil between our world and the raw architecture of existence is thin enough to tear. The ancient Sinnoh people understood this. They did not build the Spear Pillar to worship Dialga and Palkia. They built it to mark the spot where they could be encountered, a sacred observation point on the edge of the abyss. The stone pillars that rise from the ground are not decorative. They are like lightning rods, designed to attract the attention of beings who exist beyond the scope of normal perception. When you stand at the Spear Pillar in the games, the music changes. The sky turns a deep, unnatural purple. The air itself seems to vibrate with a pressure that has nothing to do with weather. This is the atmosphere of a place that is no longer entirely within our reality. It is a dock on the shores of the infinite, and it is here that the fragility of the universe becomes terrifyingly clear. Dialga and Palkia do not simply exist in separate domains. They are locked in a constant, silent tension. Time needs space to flow through, and space needs time to exist within. They are two sides of the same coin, and when that coin is flipped, reality trembles. This brings us to the most unsettling truth of this chapter. The gods of physics, the pillars of reality itself, are not immune to manipulation. They can be controlled. And when human greed reaches out to grasp them, the entire cosmos becomes brittle. In the lore of Sinnoh, this play out through the actions of Team Galactic and their leader, Cyrus. Cyrus was not a simple villain who wanted power or money. He was a nihilist who saw the world as imperfect, flawed by the messy emotions of spirit and will. He believed that by capturing Dialga and Palkia, by seizing control of time and space, he could unmake the current universe and create a new one, a perfect, silent, empty one. This is the ultimate expression of human arrogance. To look at the gods that hold the stars in their courses and say, "I will use you for my own design." Imagine the strain this places on reality. Dialga is forced to bend to a human will. Palkia is commanded to warp the distances of the world. The very laws that keep your heart beating and your feet on the ground become instruments of a single broken ambition. The universe is not designed to be commanded. It is designed to be. When you try to force the architects to build against their own nature, the structure begins to crack. This is why the player character in Pokémon Diamond, Pearl and Platinum must intervene. It is not just about stopping a bad person, it is about preventing the collapse of everything. The battle at the Spear Pillar is not a Pokémon battle in the traditional sense. It is an act of cosmic maintenance. You are not defeating Dialga or Palkia, you are freeing them from a leash, allowing them to return to their silent, eternal duty. And yet there is a third entity born from that original egg. A being who was not given a pillar to hold. This third being was cast out, banished to a world of its own. A distorted mirror of the reality Dialga and Palkia were meant to maintain. Its name is Giratina, and its story is one of the most haunting in all of Pokémon mythology. It is a story of what happens when a god is deemed too dangerous, too chaotic, too much of a threat to the order that the other two were created to uphold. The Spear Pillar was the intersection of the divine and the material. But there is another intersection, one far darker, one that leads to a place where time has no meaning, and space folds in on itself in impossible geometries. That is the domain of the Banished Shadow, and that is where our journey must go next. We have spoken of Dialga and Palkia as the architects of reality, the twin pillars upon which the entire universe rests. Time flows, space expands, and the world exists within that delicate framework. But what of the shadow that was cast the moment the first light of creation flickered into being? What of the one who was not given a pillar, but a prison? Every act of creation leaves behind a residue. When Arceus shaped the dimensions of time and space, a third entity was born, not from a deliberate act of will, but as a necessary consequence. This was Giratina, the being of antimatter, the embodiment of distortion, and from the very beginning, it was a problem that the gods did not know how to solve. The story of Giratina is the story of the forgotten third member of the creation trio. It is a story of exile, of violence perceived and punished. In the beginning, Giratina was not evil. It was not malevolent. It was simply what it was, a force of pure chaos, a living contradiction to the ordered reality that Dialga and Palkia were tasked with maintaining. Where time was a straight line, Giratina was a knot. Where space was a stable container, Giratina was a tear in the fabric. The other gods, and perhaps even Arceus itself, looked upon this being and saw a threat. They saw a creature that could unravel their perfect creation, not through malice, but through its very nature, and so judgment was passed. Giratina was deemed too violent, too unstable, too dangerous to exist within the world they had built. It was not destroyed, or even the original one could not unmake what had been made. Instead, it was banished. The exile was not a simple casting out, it was a surgical removal. Arceus, Dialga and Palkia did not just push Giratina away, they created a separate reality, a realm where the laws of the gods do not apply. This is the distortion world, a place where gravity is a suggestion, where space loops back on itself, and where time is a broken clock. It is a prison designed by the architects of reality to hold the one thing that could never fit within their blueprint. And so Giratina became the forgotten god. The world of Sinnoh knew of Dialga and Palkia. They built the Spear Pillar to honor them. They told stories of the creation of time and space. But Giratina was erased from the public myth. It became a whisper, a dark legend spoken only in hushed tones. It was the devil figure in the Pokémon cosmology, the shadow that lurked beneath the throne of heaven. But here is the truth that the myths often miss. Giratina's role was never just that of a villain. It was and is a necessary component of balance. Think about it. A universe of pure order, of perfect time and flawless space, is a universe that cannot change. It is static. It is a clockwork that never ticks. Distortion, chaos, the unexpected. These are not flaws in the system. They are the forces that allow for evolution, for adaptation, for life itself to find a way. Giratina was not banished because it was evil. It was banished because it was inconvenient to the god's vision of a pristine reality. It was the price of perfection. For generations, Giratina remained in its distortion world, a forgotten king in a broken kingdom. It watched from the shadows as the world of light and order continued without it. It grew bitter, perhaps, or perhaps it simply waited. Because in the events of the Pokémon Platinum version, the forgotten god finally got its chance to return when Team Galactic, led by the nihilistic Cyrus, attempted to use Dialga and Palkia to create a new universe free of emotion and spirit. They created a rupture. The fabric between worlds was torn, and Giratina saw its opportunity. It did not come to save the world. It came to reclaim its place. It came to remind the gods that you cannot simply cast out a part of yourself and expect to remain whole. The climax of that story is one of the most profound moments in Pokémon lore. The player, guided by the spirit of Arceus itself, must enter the distortion world. You walk through that broken reality, where the ground is a staircase to nowhere and the sky is a sea of static. And there, at the heart of the prison, you find Giratina, not a monster, but a force of nature finally given a chance to be seen. What happens next is a redemption. Not a redemption in the sense of a villain turning good, but a redemption in the sense of the universe acknowledging a mistake. By capturing or defeating Giratina, the player does not destroy the distortion, they reintegrate it. They prove that balance does not mean the absence of chaos, but the coexistence of order and disorder. Giratina's story is a warning. It tells us that every system of power, every creation myth, every act of building a world leaves someone out, and those who are left out do not simply disappear. They wait, they watch, and when the walls between worlds grow thin, they return. The distortion world is not a hell, it is a mirror. It reflects back everything that the gods of time and space tried to forget, and in that reflection the truth that the forgotten god was never the enemy, it was the missing piece. Now, as we close this chapter on the Banished Shadow, we must ask ourselves what happens when the void left by an exiled god is finally filled. What gift does the universe offer to those who have been cast out? When they are finally welcomed home, that is a story of the spirit, and it begins with a gift. Giratina was cast out, banished to a world of broken geometry and endless shadow. But the act of creation did not end with the expulsion of the distorted one. After the pillars of time and space were set, and after the void was given its dark mirror, something else was needed. Something to bridge the vast, cold machinery of the cosmos with the fragile, flickering awareness of the beings who would one day inhabit it. Arceus, the original one, had built the stage, but a stage is nothing without an audience, and an audience is nothing without a mind to perceive, a heart to feel, and a will to act. And so, from the waters of 3 secluded lakes in the Sinnoh region, 3 small beings emerged. They are easy to overlook. They lack the terrifying majesty of Dialga, the spatial enormity of Palkia, or the tragic, monstrous form of Giratina. They are small, almost delicate, with bodies that glow with a soft internal light. Their names are Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, and they are, in many ways, the most intimate gods in all of Pokémon mythology. They did not shape the continents or weave the fabric of reality. They did something far more personal. They gave the world the gift of the spirit. According to the oldest myths, preserved in the Canalav library, and whispered among the clans of Hisui, these 3 were the ones who dove into the depths of human consciousness. Uxie, the being of knowledge, granted the ability to see, to learn, to remember, and to understand. It is said that touching Uxie can erase all of your memories, leaving your mind as blank as a newborn's. Mesprit, the being of emotion, gave the capacity for joy, sorrow, love, anger, and every shade of feeling that colours a life. To look upon Mesprit is to feel the full weight of your own heart. And Azelf, the being of willpower, provided the spark of determination, the drive to act, the stubborn refusal to give up. It is Azelf that gives you the strength to get up after you have fallen. These three are the internal gods of the human psyche. They are not distant forces like the weather or the stars. They are the very voice inside your head that reasons, the ache in your chest that loves, and the fire in your gut that fights. They are the reason you can listen to this story and form an opinion about it. They are the reason you feel curiosity, or boredom, or peace. Without them, you would be a hollow shell, a biological machine with no inner world. The Lake Trio are the architects of your soul, but there is a dark side to this gift, a terrifying, fragile truth. Because what is given can be taken away, the myths do not only speak of the blessing of the Lake Guardians, they also speak of the threat. If these beings are angered, or if they are forced to withdraw their presence, the consequences are absolute. A person who loses the favour of Uxie does not simply forget a few things, they forget everything. Their identity dissolves into a silent, empty void. A person cut off from Mesprit becomes a stone, incapable of love, incapable of grief, incapable of any feeling at all, and a person stripped of Azulfs becomes a puppet, drifting without purpose, unable to even choose to end their own suffering. The Lake Guardians are not just benevolent spirits, they are the gatekeepers of your humanity, and they can lock the gate forever. This is why the ancient people of Sinnoh treated them with such reverence and such fear. They built shrines at the edges of the lakes, not to worship, but to maintain a careful distance. They understood that these beings were not to be controlled, they were to be respected. To approach them was to risk everything. And yet, there were those who saw this power not as a sacred trust, but as a resource to be exploited. This is where the story of the Lake Guardians takes its darkest turn. In the history of the Sinnoh region, there exists a legend of a terrible object, the Red Chain, a chain forged not from metal, but from the very essence of the Lake Guardians themselves. The ritual to create it was an act of profound violation. It required capturing Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, and draining a portion of their spiritual energy. This energy, this raw psychic force of knowledge, emotion, and will, was then bound into a physical form. The Red Chain was a leash. It was a tool designed to bind the gods of time and space themselves. By stealing the power of the spirit, a human, or perhaps something worse, could seize control of Dialga and Palkia. It was the ultimate act of hubris, to enslave the mind of the world in order to command the fabric of reality. Think about what that means. The very forces that allow you to think and feel were ripped from their guardians and twisted into a weapon. The Red Chain is not just a plot device. It is a symbol of the deepest violation imaginable. It is the theft of the soul, weaponized against the cosmos. And it worked. In the climax of the ancient conflict, the Red Chain was used to summon Dialga and Palkia to the spear pillar, forcing them into a confrontation that threatened to tear the universe apart. The Lake Guardians, drained and imprisoned, could only watch as their power was used for destruction. This is the forgotten tragedy of the Lake Trio. They are not just the cute floating spirits that grant you a type advantage in battle. They are the silent, suffering heart of the Sinnoh mythos. They gave us everything that makes us human, and in return, they were bound and bled for their gifts. Their story is a quiet one, a story of sacrifice and vulnerability. They are the gods who were preyed upon, the gods who were used, and yet they endured. Even after the Red Chain was broken, even after the crisis at Spear Pillar was resolved, the scars remained. The Lake Guardians retreated to their sanctuaries, deeper into the lakes, more wary of the humans they had once blessed. They are still there, waiting, watching. They remember what was done to them, and they remember that the power they hold is the only thing standing between a thinking, feeling world and a silent, empty one. So when you think of the forgotten gods of Pokémon, do not only think of the cosmic titans. Think of Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, the small, luminous beings who swim in the dark waters of Lake Acuity, Lake Verity, and Lake Valor. They are the reason you have a self to call your own, and they are the reason that self can be lost. The gift of the spirit is the most precious gift of all, and it is the most fragile. But even the spirit can be fractured, and when the truth is broken, what remains is not a lie, but a hollow echo. That is a story for another time, a story of a dragon split in two, and the cold, empty shell that was left behind. A story of a war fought not over land, but over belief itself. That is the story of the fractured truth. We ended the last chapter standing on the shores of a lake in Sinnoh, reflecting on the gifts of knowledge, emotion, and willpower that Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf bestowed upon humanity. Those three spirits gave us the tools to think, to feel, and to choose. But what happens when those tools are turned inward and the mind splits against itself? What happens when knowledge and emotion become warring factions within a single soul? That question leads us far from the quiet lakes of Sinnoh, across the ocean to the ancient and fractured land of Unova, where a god was not born, but broken. The legend of the original dragon of Unova is unlike any other creation myth in the Pokémon world. It does not begin with an egg emerging from chaos, nor with a cosmic being shaping the fabric of reality. It begins with two brothers, twin princes, who once shared a single vision. They ruled a prosperous kingdom, and at the heart of their power was a dragon of immense and perfect unity. This dragon was not a god of time or space, not a force of nature like the weather trio. It was a god of conviction, a being that embodied the complete and undivided will of its people. It was whole, but the brothers grew apart. As the kingdom flourished, so did their differences. One brother became obsessed with the pursuit of objective truth, the cold, hard facts of the world. He believed that a kingdom should be built on what is real, on what can be proven, on the unvarnished reality of existence. The other brother, however, was driven by ideals, by the vision of a perfect future, by the belief that hope and aspiration could reshape the world into something better than it was. Both were right, both were wrong, and the dragon, which was the living embodiment of their shared spirit, could not bear the division. The legend tells us that the twin princes could not reconcile. Their conflict grew from a philosophical disagreement into a civil war. And in that moment of ultimate fracture, the original dragon did what no other divine being had ever done. It did not fight. It did not retreat. It split itself apart. From the single perfect being emerged two dragons, each one a fragment of the original whole. One was Reshiram, the vessel of truth, its body wreathed in white flame, its eyes burning with the certainty of what is. The other was Zekrom, the embodiment of ideals, its body cloaked in black thunder, its heart pulsing with the lightning of what could be. The two dragons chose sides. Reshiram allied with the prince who sought truth. Zekrom stood with the prince who championed ideals, and the kingdom was torn asunder. This is the story that the people of Unova have passed down for generations, but it is a story that asks a deeply uncomfortable question. If truth and ideals are both noble pursuits, why must they be at war? Why can they not coexist? The answer, perhaps, lies in the nature of the human condition. We are not simple creatures. We hold contradictory beliefs. We want to know the truth, but we also want to believe in a future that may not be supported by the facts. We want to be realistic, but we also want to dream. The conflict between Reshiram and Zekrom is not just an ancient myth about two dragons. It is a mirror held up to our own internal struggles. Every time you choose between a difficult truth and a comforting ideal, you are reenacting the schism of Unova. And yet the story does not end with the two dragons. There is a third piece. There is a shadow that lingers in the coldest corners of the region, a being that is neither truth nor ideal, but the absence of both. That being is Kyurem. According to the oldest texts, when the original dragon split, it did not divide cleanly into two equal halves. Something was left behind, a husk, an empty shell. Kyurem is the forgotten remains of a once perfect divine being, the part of the dragon that was too broken to become anything at all. It is a creature of ice, not because it was born of cold, but because it is frozen in a state of incompleteness. It cannot burn with the fire of truth. It cannot crackle with the lightning of ideals. It can only exist, hollow and waiting. The tragedy of Kyurem is perhaps the most profound tragedy in all of Pokémon mythology. Here is a god that was broken by the warring ambitions of twin princes. It did not choose a side. It did not fight in the war. It was simply discarded, the leftover matter of a divine being that could no longer hold itself together. In many ways, Kyurem is the most human of the Tao trio. It represents the parts of ourselves we lose when we are torn between two opposing forces. It is the grief of a decision that leaves a piece of you behind. It is the cold, empty feeling of knowing that you cannot be whole again. The people of Unova do not worship Kyurem, they fear it. They tell stories of a monster that dwells in a giant chasm, a creature that absorbs the energy of other Pokémon, desperately trying to fill the void inside itself. And in a way, that is exactly what Kyurem is doing. It is searching for the fragments of its former self. In some tellings of the legend, Kyurem can fuse with Reshiram or Zekrom, temporarily reclaiming a fraction of its original power, but it is never a true reunion. The fusion is unstable, a forced union of broken pieces. The original dragon, the perfect being that once existed, is gone forever. All that remains are the fragments and the empty shell. This myth forces us to confront a difficult truth about divinity itself. The gods of the Pokémon world are not always eternal and unchanging. They can be wounded, they can be diminished, they can be forgotten. The original dragon was not slain by a hero or sealed away by an ancient civilization. It was destroyed by the very people who loved it, by the princes who could not see past their own convictions. The tragedy is that both brothers were trying to build a better world. They simply could not agree on what that world should look like, and their god paid the price. As you drift further into the quiet of the night, consider the weight of that story. Every conflict, every argument, every war between truth and ideals leaves a mark, not just on the world, but on the things we hold sacred. The fracture of Unova is not a distant legend. It is a pattern that repeats itself in every generation, in every heart that dares to hold two opposing beliefs at once. And yet the story does not end with the cold silence of Kyurem's chasm. There is another legend, one that speaks of a flower that blooms only once, and a weapon that was built from the ashes of love and loss. That is the story we will turn to next, in a chapter called The Eternal Flower and the Weapon. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The legend of the original dragon of Unova told a story of division, of a single perfect truth fractured into two opposing ideals. But what happens when the conflict is not between truth and belief, but between the very forces of existence itself? What happens when life and death are not metaphors for a philosophical argument, but literal, tangible energies that can be harvested, weaponized, and turned against the world? This is the story of Kalos, a region where the divine is not a distant creator or a philosophical principle, but a biological constant, a cycle as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. And at the heart of this cycle lies a story of grief, of loss, and of a weapon so terrible it nearly unmade the world. Kalos is a region of elegance and beauty, of grand architecture and ancient chateaus, but beneath its polished surface lies a scar, a wound in history that still bleeds into the present. This scar is the legacy of a war, a conflict so devastating that it drove one man to the edge of madness. That man was Aziz, the king of Kalos in a time long before the modern era. He was not a tyrant, not a conqueror in the traditional sense. He was a ruler who loved his people, but more than that, he loved one being above all others, his Pokémon, a Floette. This was no ordinary partnership. The bond between Azid and his Floette was legendary, a connection so deep that when the war came and claimed her life, it broke something fundamental within him, and so Azid did what no one had ever done before. He refused to accept death. He refused to let the cycle of life and decay claim what was his. He turned to the ancient powers of Kalos, the forces that govern the very rhythm of existence. He sought out the beings that embodied these forces, the ones that the people of Kalos had always known, but never truly understood. He sought out Xerneas, the Pokémon of life, and Yveltal, the Pokémon of destruction. Now these two are not gods in the way Arceus is a god. They do not create universes or shape the fabric of reality. They are more fundamental than that. They are biological constants, the physical embodiment of the two poles of existence. Xerneas is the force that drives growth, renewal, and the endless proliferation of life. It is the energy that makes a seed sprout, that heals a wound, that allows a creature to be born. Yveltal is its opposite, the force of entropy, of decay, of the inevitable end. It is the energy that breaks down the old to make way for the new, that returns all things to the dust from which they came. They are not enemies. They are partners in a dance as old as the planet itself. One cannot exist without the other. Life without death is stagnation, an endless, suffocating expansion. Death without life is a void, a silent, empty nothing. Together they form a closed loop, a perfect self-sustaining cycle. But AZ did not want the cycle. He wanted to break it. He wanted to take the power of Xerneas, the pure, unadulterated energy of life, and use it to reverse a single death. He wanted to hijack the divine for a personal, desperate purpose. And so he built the ultimate weapon. This was not a simple machine. It was a technological marvel, a device designed to capture and focus the life force of Xerneas itself. But to power it, to generate enough energy, to defy the natural order, he needed more than just the essence of one Pokémon. He needed a catalyst. He needed the life force of countless others. The ultimate weapon was activated, and it drew upon the energy of every living thing in the region. It drained the life from the land, from the Pokémon, from the people. It was a catastrophic, world-altering event, and it worked. AZ's Floette was revived. She returned to him, her petals restored, her light shining once more, but the cost was immeasurable. The war that had taken her life was ended, not through peace, but through absolute horrifying force. The weapon had not only resurrected his friend, it had also unleashed a wave of destruction that wiped out countless lives. The very energy of life had been twisted into a tool of death. This is the terrible irony of the ultimate weapon. It was a human attempt to hijack the power of life and death, to take the sacred cycle and bend it to a single will. Azid, in his grief, had forgotten that the power of Xerneas and Yveltal is not a resource to be mined. It is a balance to be respected. By forcing life where death had claimed its due, he created an imbalance, a wound in the world that would take millennia to heal. And in the aftermath, his Floette, the very being he had sacrificed everything for, could not bear to look at him. She saw what he had done, the ashes he had created in her name, and she left him. She abandoned him to walk the earth alone, immortal and cursed, for over 3,000 years. And so, the King of Kalos became a wanderer, a forgotten figure in the history he had shattered. The weapon was sealed away, its technology lost to time, but its legacy remained. The land itself remembered. The energy of that cataclysm lingered, and it gave rise to a new phenomenon, a strange, radiant power that would one day be known as Mega Evolution. This is the shadow of the ultimate weapon, a permanent scar on the fabric of the region. Every time a trainer in Kalos triggers a Mega Evolution, they are tapping into the same corrupted energy that AZ unleashed. They are drawing upon the remnants of that ancient, desperate act. This is why the Kalos gods feel so different from the mythologies of other regions. Xerneas and Yveltal are not worshipped in temples. They are not the subjects of elaborate creation stories or philosophical debates. They are simply there, woven into the very biology of the world. They are the reason a flower blooms and the reason it wilts. They are the reason a Pokémon is born and the reason it eventually fades. They are constants, as predictable and as unavoidable as gravity, and this makes them perhaps the most terrifying of all the forgotten gods, because you cannot bargain with a constant. You cannot pray to it or appease it. You can only accept it. The story of AZ is a warning. It is a reminder that the divine, in all its forms, is not meant to be controlled. The forces of life and death are not tools for our grief or our ambition. They are the foundation of existence itself, and to tamper with them is to invite catastrophe. Kalos, for all its beauty, is a region built on a grave, a monument to a king's love and a king's folly. And as the world moves on, as new generations forget the ancient war, the memory of that weapon and the cycle it tried to break still lingers in the air, in the stones, in the very light of the region. But the cycle is not the only force that watches over the world. There is another, a being that does not govern life or death, but the balance between them. A silent watcher that ensures the ecosystem does not tip too far in one direction. This is the story of Zygarde, the Order Pokémon, and the role it plays in a world that is always teetering on the edge of chaos. And that is a tale for the next chapter. We have spent time among the gods of the sky, the architects of reality, and the forces of life and death. But there is a different kind of divinity, one that does not dwell in the heavens or in the realm of spirits. It lives beneath our feet, in the soil, in the roots of trees, in the very cells of the planet. This is the story of Zygarde, the Order Pokémon, and its role as the ecosystem's silent watcher. If Xerneas is the pulse of life and Yveltal the inevitable decay, then Zygarde is the immune system. It is not a god of creation or destruction, but of balance. And like any immune system, it is invisible until it is needed. Most of the time, Zygarde does not exist as a single entity. It is scattered, fragmented, hidden. Its true form is a network of cells, each one no larger than a speck of dust, buried in the earth, woven into the roots of forests, drifting through the water. These are the Zygarde cores and cells, and they are the key to understanding what this Pokémon truly is. Imagine a being that is not born, but assembled, a consciousness that does not reside in a single body, but in 1,000, 1,000,000, scattered across an entire region. Each Zygarde cell is a tiny piece of a larger mind, a neuron in a planetary brain. The cores are the command centers, the decision makers. They are the ones that feel the world, that sense when something is wrong, when the ecosystem is threatened, when a legendary being oversteps its bounds, when the natural order is disrupted. The cores call out, and the cells respond. They begin to move, to converge, to assemble. From the soil, from the rivers, from the canopies of the Kalos region, they rise. First, they form a small dog-like shape, a 10% form that is still incomplete, still gathering strength. Then, as more cells arrive, the form grows, becoming a towering serpentine creature with a core of green and black, the 50% form. And if the threat is great enough, if the balance is truly shattered, the cells will continue to gather, forming the complete form, a colossal, humanoid dragon, a living weapon of pure order. This is the fail-safe. The other legendaries of Kalos, Xerneas and Yveltal, are forces of nature, but they are not controlled. They are cycles. They do not have a sense of proportion. Xerneas can grant eternal life, and Yveltal can bring total annihilation. They are the fire and the flood, the birth and the death. But Zygarde is the regulator. It is the dam that holds back the flood, the firebreak that stops the blaze. It does not create or destroy for its own sake. It only responds. It is the planet's way of saying, enough. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because Zygarde is not a god that demands worship. It does not have a temple. It does not have a myth cycle in the way that Ho-Oh or the Tapu do. It is not remembered in songs or dances. It is forgotten, not because it is weak, but because it is subtle. The people of Kalos do not pray to Zygarde. They do not even know it exists, for the most part. It is a ghost in the machine, a silent watcher in the soil. Think about what that means. The other gods we have discussed, Arceus, Dialga, Palkia, they are grand, cosmic, obvious. Their power is written in the stars. But Zygarde's power is written in the dirt. It is the god of the earth's health, not its surface, but its deep, living, breathing biology. It is the cellular guardian of the planet's balance. Every root that anchors the soil, every microbe that breaks down decay, every worm that aerates the ground, Zygarde is connected to it all. It is the consciousness of the ecosystem itself. This is a profound shift in how we understand divinity in the Pokémon world. We have moved from the gods of the sky the beings of time and space, to the gods of the Earth's health. It is a transition from the cosmic to the biological, from the abstract to the concrete, from the creator to the caretaker. Zygarde does not need to be worshipped, because it is not separate from the world. It is the world. It is the soil, the water, the air. It is the network that holds everything together. And yet, for all its power, Zygarde is also a prisoner of its own purpose. It cannot act unless it is provoked. It cannot prevent a disaster, only respond to one. It is a reactive force, not a proactive one. This is its tragedy. It watches, it waits, and it only moves when the damage is already done. The cores are scattered, hidden, patient. They are the silent watchers, and they have been watching for a very long time. But what happens when the threat is not a single legendary, but a slow creeping decay? What happens when the balance is not broken by a great catastrophe, but by 1,000 small cuts? Can Zygarde respond to pollution, to habitat loss, to the slow death of a forest? Or is it only designed for the dramatic, the catastrophic, the legendary? The games do not give us a clear answer. They leave the mystery intact. Zygarde remains an enigma, a being of immense power that is almost never seen, almost never understood. And that is perhaps its greatest gift to the lore. It reminds us that not all gods are loud, not all power is visible. Some of the most important forces in the world are the ones we never see, the ones that work in silence, in the dark, in the soil. Zygarde is the forgotten god of the earth, and it is content to remain forgotten. As long as the balance holds, it will sleep. As long as the ecosystem breathes, it will wait. And if that balance ever truly breaks, it will rise. And it will not stop until order is restored. From the silent watcher in the soil, we must now turn our gaze to the sea, to a chain of islands where the gods are not hidden, but celebrated, where the divine is not a distant force, but a daily presence, where the guardians of the land are not a single being, but a family. This is the story of the Tapu, the guardians of the Archipelago, and the living religion of Alola. Zygarde watches from the soil, from the roots of trees, from the dust beneath your feet. It is the silent warden of planetary order, but its gaze is not personal. It does not bless a village or curse a thief. It simply maintains the balance of the ecosystem on a scale so vast that individual human lives barely register. That is one kind of divinity, the distant, cosmic kind that holds the world together but never speaks your name. But there is another kind of god, a god that lives on your island, that knows your face, that might help you find a lost berry or knock your hat off just to see you jump. And that is where we go now, to the tropical archipelago of Alola, where the divine is not distant but intimate, not cosmic but communal. Alola is a region of 4 main islands, each one crowned by a volcano, each one surrounded by warm, crystal clear waters. The people there live in a world that feels more contained than the vast continents of Sinnoh or Unova, and perhaps because of that, their gods are smaller too, not in power, but in scope. The Tapu are not creators of time or space. They do not govern the flow of history or the structure of reality. They govern the land you walk on, the grove you pick fruit from, the shore where you fish. They are territorial divinities, bound to specific islands, and their authority is local. This is the concept of localized divinity, and it is one of the most fascinating shifts in Pokémon mythology. The Tapu of Alola are 4 in number. Tapu Koko, the guardian of Melemele Island, is associated with electricity and speed, a god of sudden storms and quick decisions. Tapu Lele of Akala Island governs healing and life force, but her blessings are not always gentle. Tapu Bulu of Ulaula Island commands grass and growth, but also decay, the slow rot of the forest floor. And Tapu Fini of Pony Island controls water and mist, the boundary between the known world and the unknown. Each Tapu has a distinct personality, and each is worshipped not as a distant force, but as a living presence in the community. But here is the key difference between the Tapu and the gods we have discussed before. Arceus, Dialga, Palkia, even Zygarde, they are forces of nature or creation. They are often indifferent to human affairs. The Tapu are not indifferent. They are deeply, personally involved. in the lives of the people who live on their islands. And they are temperamental. They are gods. They're both protectors and pranksters. In Alolan folklore, Tapu Koko is known for stealing things, for playing tricks on travelers, for testing the courage of young people. Tapu Lele might heal a wound, but she might also inflict a strange illness just to see how you handle it. These are not the solemn, distant deities of Sinnoh. They are more like the old gods of Polynesian mythology. Beings who are powerful but also capricious, who demand respect but also enjoy a good joke. The people of Alola have learned to live with this temperamental divinity. They do not build grand temples and pray from a distance. They build a relationship, and the central expression of that relationship is the Island Challenge. Now, if you are familiar with Pokémon games, you know the Island Challenge as the Alolan equivalent of the Gym Challenge. But in the lore of the world, it is much more than that. The Island Challenge is a covenant. It is a sacred pact between the people and their gods. Each island has a kahuna, a human leader, who serves as an intermediary between the community and the Tapu. And the challenge itself is a series of trials designed to test not just a trainer's strength, but their character, their respect for the land, their understanding of the island's spirit. When you complete the Island Challenge, you are not just earning badges, you are proving yourself worthy of the Tapu's blessing. You are showing that you understand the covenant, and at the end of the challenge, you are granted the right to face the Tapu themselves in battle. This is not a fight to the death. It is a ritual, a test of worthiness. The Tapu want to see if you have grown, if you have learned the lessons of the island, if you can be trusted with the power they guard, and if you win, you earn their respect. You become, in a sense, part of the island's spiritual family. This is a radically different relationship from the one we saw in Sinnoh. In Sinnoh, the gods are cosmic. They exist on a level that humans can barely comprehend. You do not befriend Dialga. You do not joke with Palkia. You might pray to them, but you would never expect them to answer personally. The Tapu, on the other hand, are community gods. They are the gods of a single island, a single village, a single family line. They know the names of the people who live there. They know which child is afraid of the dark and which elder tells the best stories. And they care, not in the way a parent cares, but in the way a guardian cares. They are territorial. They protect their land fiercely, but they also expect the people to protect it too. This covenant is not one-sided. The people of Alola do not simply receive blessings. They have responsibilities. They must maintain the sacred sites, perform the proper rituals, and most importantly, they must respect the boundaries of the Tapu. There are places on each island that are considered Tapu, sacred and forbidden. Entering without permission is not just a crime, it is a spiritual offense. The Tapu may punish you directly, or they may withdraw their protection from the entire community. So the people live in a state of careful balance, always aware that their gods are watching, always aware that their gods are near. And this brings us to the contrast between the cosmic gods of Sinnoh and the community gods of Alola. In Sinnoh, divinity is about creation and order. Arceus creates the universe, Dialga governs time, Palkia governs space. These are abstract concepts. They are the framework of reality itself. In Alola, divinity is about place and relationship. The Tapu do not create the universe. They protect a specific stretch of beach, a particular forest, a certain mountain. Their power is not in shaping reality, but in shaping the lives of the people who live within their territory. And that makes them feel more real, more present, more like gods you could actually meet. Think about what it means to live in a world where your god might appear at any moment. You are walking home from the market and a flash of yellow feathers streaks past you. It is Tapu Koko, and he has just stolen the fruit you were carrying. Do you get angry? No. You laugh. You know it is a test. You know he is watching to see if you will complain, or if you will accept the trick with good humour. And if you pass the test, maybe he will leave a rare berry on your doorstep tomorrow. This is the relationship. It is playful, but it is also serious. The Tapu are not your friends. They are your guardians. They will protect you from outside threats, but they will also keep you humble. And this is why the Island Challenge is so important. It is the formal expression of this covenant. Every trial you complete, every grand trial you overcome, is a step toward becoming a true member of the island community. You are not just proving your strength to the kahuna, you are proving your worth to the tapu themselves. And when you finally stand before the Guardian, when you look into the eyes of a god that has watched over your island for centuries, you are not just a challenger, you are a child of the island, asking for the blessing of its oldest inhabitant. The tapu are not forgotten gods. They are actively remembered, actively worshipped, actively engaged with, but they are also misunderstood by outsiders. Many trainers from other regions see the tapu as just powerful Pokémon to be caught. They do not understand the covenant. They do not understand that when you capture a tapu, you are not just adding a Pokémon to your team, you are taking a god away from its island. You are breaking the covenant, and the people of Alola feel that loss deeply. In the games, you can catch the tapu, but the lore suggests that this is a profound disruption of the natural spiritual order. The tapu are meant to stay on their islands, protecting their people. Taking them away is like removing the heart from a living body. So as we leave Alola, we carry with us this image of a different kind of divinity. Gods that are small enough to know your name, powerful enough to protect your home, and playful enough to steal your lunch. It is a beautiful, intimate relationship, and it stands in stark contrast to the vast, cold cosmos of Sinnoh. But Alola is not the only region where the divine takes a strange form. There are other powers, other beings, that exist not in the soil or the sky, but in the spaces between. And one of them waits in the darkness beyond the islands. A being of pure light that has been broken and hungry for longer than any human can remember. That story begins in the Ultra Space, where light itself has a shadow. The tapu of Alola watch over their islands with a fierce and personal devotion. But they are not the only powers that dwell in the skies, above that tropical archipelago, beyond the guardian deities, beyond the volcanic peaks and the coral reefs. The people of Alola have always looked up and seen something stranger in the heavens. They saw the sun and the moon, of course, but they also saw doorways. They saw beings that were not born of this world, but came from somewhere else entirely, riding on beams of light. The ancient Alolans did not have the language of astrophysics or the concept of alternate dimensions. They had only the sky and the sea, and the stories passed down through generations. When they saw a great lion made of molten gold stride across the horizon, they did not call it an extraterrestrial, they called it a god. When they saw a giant bat whose wings held the darkness of the deep ocean, they called it a messenger of the night. And when they saw a third figure, a being of such terrible hunger that it devoured every star it passed, they called it the Blinding One, and they prayed that it would never find their world. But the truth, as it so often is in the history of Pokemon's forgotten gods, is far stranger than any myth. The beings that Alola came to revere as Solgaleo and Lunala were not native to this reality at all. They were travelers from Ultra Space, a dimension that exists alongside our own, separated by a membrane of light and energy that most beings can never cross. And yet, these two entities had made the journey. They had found a way through the fabric of existence, and in doing so, they had become the emissaries between two worlds. Solgaleo, the beast of the sun, was not a creature of fire in the way that a mortal might understand. Its body was composed of pure, condensed light, the same energy that powers the stars themselves. When it moved, it did not walk so much as it radiated, each step leaving a trail of golden particles that hung in the air like a promise of dawn. The ancient Alolans built their calendars around its appearances. They knew that when Solgaleo passed overhead, the days grew longer and the harvests were bountiful. They believed it was the sun itself, given form and will. And Lunala, the bat of the moon, was its counterpart in every way that mattered. Where Solgaleo was brilliant and blinding, Lunala was deep and reflective. Its wings were not made of flesh and bone. but of a dark, ethereal substance that absorbed light rather than emitting it. When it flew, it seemed to pull the night behind it like a cloak. The ancient Alolans watched it rise over the ocean, and they felt a strange comfort in its shadow, because they understood that darkness was not the absence of light, but a different kind of presence altogether. These two beings were not gods in the sense that they demanded worship. They did not answer prayers or punish the unfaithful. They simply existed, and their existence shaped the world around them. The people of Alola built temples in their honor, not because they feared them, but because they recognized that Solgaleo and Lunala were bridges. They were the connection between the world that humans could touch and the world that lay beyond the veil of ultra space. But there was a third traveler, and its story is the one that the ancient Alolans tried very hard to forget. Necrozma was not always the broken, light-starved creature that we know today. In the earliest records, the ones that have been almost entirely lost to time, Necrozma was described as the Blinding One, a being of such radiant power that it could illuminate entire dimensions. It was not a predator, it was not a destroyer, it was a source, a wellspring of pure, unending light that sustained the ecosystems of ultra-space the way the sun sustains our own world. But something happened. Something went terribly wrong. The fall of Necrozma is not a story of betrayal or war. It is a story of isolation and starvation. At some point in the distant past, Necrozma became separated from the source of its power. Perhaps it was cast out. Perhaps it wandered too far and lost its way. The details are lost, but the result is clear. The Blinding One began to dim. Its light, once infinite, began to flicker and fade, and as the light died, so did the being that had been defined by it. What remained was a husk, a creature of black crystalline armor that no longer shone, but instead hungered. Necrozma became a being that could not produce its own light, and so it was forced to consume the light of others. It became a starving god, driven by an instinct that was older than memory and more desperate than any mortal need. When Necrozma first appeared in the skies above Alola, the people did not recognize it. They saw a dark shape blotting out the stars, a shadow that moved against the natural order of the night, and then they felt it. The warmth began to drain from the air. The colors of the world seemed to leach away, leaving everything grey and cold. Necrozma was feeding. It was drinking the light from the very atmosphere, pulling the energy out of every living thing it passed over. The ancient Alolans did not have the power to fight such a being. They could only hide and pray that the Tapu would protect them, and in a way the Tapu did. But it was not the guardian deities that ultimately drove Necrozma away. It was Solgaleo and Lunala. The emissaries of ultraspace recognized Necrozma for what it was, a broken remnant of a once great power. They did not destroy it, because destruction was not in their nature. Instead, they drove it back into the depths of ultraspace, sealing the pathways behind it so that it could not return. They sacrificed their own connection, their home dimension, to protect the world they had come to love. But Necrozma did not die. It could not die. It simply waited, buried in the darkness between worlds, growing weaker and more desperate with every passing millennium. The light it had consumed was not enough. It was never enough. And so it dreamed of a day when the barriers would weaken, when the doorways would open again, and when it could finally feast on the light of a world that had forgotten its name. The Alolan people did not forget entirely. They passed down the story of the Blinding One as a warning, a cautionary tale told to children who stayed out too late after dark. But as the generations passed, the story became myth, and the myth became legend, and the legend became a half-remembered fear that no one could quite explain. And yet, the truth remained, buried in the ruins of ancient temples and in the genetic memory of the Ultra Beasts that still wandered the corridors of Ultra Space. Solgaleo and Lunala were not gods. They were refugees. They were guardians who had chosen exile to protect a world that was not their own. And Necrozma was not a monster. It was a victim of its own nature, a being that had been twisted by loss into something that could only take and never give. The horror of a starving god is not that it is evil. The horror is that it has no choice. Necrozma does not consume light because it wants to cause suffering. It consumes light because it will die if it does not. And in its desperation, it has become something that the universe fears, a shadow that moves through the void, searching for a warmth it can never truly hold. But there is another layer to this story, one that the ancient Alolans could never have understood. The light that Necrozma craves is not just the light of stars or the light of the sun, it is the light of life itself. Every living thing emits a faint glow, a signature of the energy that animates it, and Necrozma can sense that glow from across dimensions. It is drawn to worlds that are teeming with life, because those worlds are full of the light it needs to survive. Alola was one of those worlds, and if the barriers ever fall again, it will be the first place that Necrozma returns to. The emissaries of Ultra Space, Solgaleo and Lunala, understood this risk better than anyone. They had seen what Necrozma had become, and they had made a choice. They would remain in this world, watching over it, keeping the pathways closed, and hoping that the Blinding One would never find its way back. They became the sun and the moon of Alola, not because they wanted to be worshipped, but because they needed to be seen. They needed the people to remember that there was a light worth protecting. And so the ancient Alolans built their temples and told their stories. They danced under the moon and prayed to the sun. They lived in a covenant with beings that were not of their world, and they called them gods, because they had no other word for what they were. But the truth is that Solgaleo and Lunala were never gods. They were guardians. They were exiles. They were the last line of defense against a hunger that could swallow the stars. And somewhere in the darkness between dimensions, Necrozma still waits. It waits for a crack in the armor of reality. It waits for a moment of weakness. And when that moment comes, it will rise again, not as a god, but as a reminder that even the brightest light can be consumed by the void. But that is a story for another time. For now, the sun still rises over Alola, and the moon still casts its silver light across the waves, and the people sleep, unaware of the ancient bargain that keeps the darkness at bay. The next chapter in this history takes us far from the tropical shores of Alola to a land of mist and stone, where two great wolves once fought to defend a kingdom from a calamity that fell from the sky. The story of the heroic kings of Galar is a tale of sacrifice, of loyalty, and of a power so immense that it had to be sealed away for the safety of the world. And it begins with a sword, a shield, and a darkness that refused to stay buried. From the light-devouring emptiness of ultra space, we now turn to a very different kind of forgotten power, not a cosmic entity that lost its light, but a pair of beings whose light was deliberately hidden, rewritten into the shadow of human glory. We are traveling to the Galar region, a land of industrial revolution, sprawling cities, and a deep, almost to theatrical love for competition. But beneath the stadiums and the cheering crowds lies a history that has been carefully edited. A story of two wolves and a star that fell from the sky. The legend of Galar begins not with a king, but with a catastrophe. Long before the first Pokeball was crafted, before the first gym badge was forged, the land was consumed by a phenomenon known only as the Darkest Day. This was not a simple storm or a volcanic eruption. It was an event that warped the very nature of the world, a surge of energy so vast and so malevolent that it threatened to swallow the entire region in an endless night. The skies turned black, not with clouds, but with a seething crimson energy that drained the colour from the earth. Pokémon grew monstrous, their forms twisted by the raw power that saturated the air. It was a time of pure, unadulterated chaos. At the heart of this calamity was a being that had arrived from beyond the stars. Eternatus. This was not a god of nature, not a guardian of a lake or a creator of the land. Eternatus was an extraterrestrial force, a living battery of infinite energy that had crashed into the planet eons ago. It was a creature of pure, raw power, a wellspring of the very substance that would later be known as Dynamax energy. It lay dormant for millennia, buried deep within the earth until something awakened it. And when it stirred, the energy it bled into the world became the darkest day. It was not a punishment from a wrathful deity. It was a natural disaster, a leak from a broken reactor that had always been there, waiting. In the face of this overwhelming alien power, 2 Pokémon rose to meet it. These were not the gods of creation we have seen in Sinnoh, nor the philosophical ideals of Unova. These were warriors. Their names were Zacian and Zamazenta. In the oldest texts, before they were called kings or heroes, they were simply known as the ancient guardians of the slumbering Weald. They were not worshipped as deities in the traditional sense. They were protectors, tied to the forests and the wild places of Galar. They were gods of nature, of the untamed land that existed before the cities and the railways. But the darkest day forced them to evolve. They could no longer simply watch over the woods. They had to become something new. They had to become champions. Zacian and Zamazenta were not alone. They were aided by a human king, a figure who would later take all the credit. But in the true story, the king was a partner, a wielder of a weapon that could channel the power of the 2 Pokémon. Together they faced Eternatus. The battle was not one of philosophy or creation. It was a war of attrition against an endless tide of energy. Zacian, the sister, wielded a sword that could cut through the very fabric of the darkest day. Zamazenta, the brother, carried a shield that could withstand the crushing weight of Eternatus's power. They were the transition from passive nature gods to active gods of chivalry and war. They did not command the elements. They fought with blade and armor. They were the first knights. In the end, they prevailed. They did not destroy Eternatus. That was impossible. Instead, they sealed it. They used their combined strength to imprison the extraterrestrial entity deep within the earth, containing its infinite energy within a device that would later be known as the Dark Stone. The darkest day ended, the skies cleared, and the land of Galar was saved. But then came the rewriting. The human king, the one who had fought alongside the 2 wolves, did not want to share the glory. He wanted his legacy to be one of human triumph, not a story of divine intervention. And so, the history of Galar was systematically altered. The names of Zacian and Zamazenta were erased from the public record. They were replaced by the name of the king and his descendants. The slumbering Weald, the sacred forest, where the 2 Pokémon had rested for centuries, was declared off-limits, a forbidden zone where the old stories were left to rot. The truth was buried. The people of Galar were taught that their ancestors, the great kings of old, had defeated the darkest day with their own strength and ingenuity. They were taught that the Dynamax energy, the very power that made their stadium battles so spectacular, was a natural resource of their land, a gift from their heroic lineage. They were taught to forget the wolves. And so for generations, the legend of Zacian and Zamazenta faded into myth. They became a children's story, a fairy tale about 2 noble Pokémon who lived in the woods. No one believed they were real. The Galar region built its identity on the lie. The gym challenge, the massive stadiums, the entire culture of competitive battling was built upon the foundation of a stolen history. The kings became the heroes. The Pokémon became the forgotten gods. But the truth has a way of persisting. It hides in the places we are told not to look. The slumbering Weald remained, a pocket of ancient forest untouched by the industrial progress of Galar. It was a place of deep silence, where the trees grew thick and the light barely pierced the canopy. It was here, in the heart of the forgotten land, that the 2 wolves slept. They were not dead. They were waiting. They were waiting for someone to rediscover the truth, to find the rusted sword and the rusted shield that were the remnants of their ancient forms. They were waiting for a new hero to challenge the false history that had been built upon their backs. When a young trainer finally ventured into the slumbering Weald, the forest itself seemed to wake. The mist parted, the path revealed itself, and there, in the deepest grove, the 2 ancient guardians stirred. They were not the majestic, armoured warriors of legend at first. They were faded, their forms dulled by centuries of neglect and forgotten faith. They were known as the hero of many battles, and the hero of many battles, their true names lost to time. But their purpose was clear. They had returned to correct the record. The rediscovery of the slumbering Weald was not just the finding of 2 Pokémon. It was the unearthing of a buried truth. It was the moment when the false kings of Galar were finally exposed. The true legends were not human, they were the wolves. And when the trainer helped them reclaim their lost weapons, the rusted sword and the rusted shield, they transformed. The rust fell away, revealing the gleaming, heroic forms of Zacian and Zamazenta. They became the crowned sword and the crowned shield, the gods of chivalry reborn in a world that had forgotten them. Their battle against Eternatus was reenacted, but this time the truth was witnessed. The darkest day threatened to return, the seal on the dark stone weakening after so many years. But Zacian and Zamazenta, with a new partner by their side, were ready. They did not fight for glory, they fought for the truth. They fought to reclaim their place in history. And when Eternatus was finally subdued, not destroyed but captured, the people of Galar had to confront the lie they had been living. The statues of the kings were not torn down, but they were no longer the only monuments. The wolves were given their due. This is the story of how nature gods became war gods, how an extraterrestrial star became a source of infinite energy, and how a history was rewritten and then restored. It is a reminder that the gods we forget are often the ones who saved us. And now, as we leave the industrial spires of Galar behind, we must look to a different kind of kingdom. A kingdom not of steel and stadiums, but of earth and harvest. A place where the forgotten god is not a warrior, but a provider. The next chapter of our journey takes us to a land of plenty, where a king once ruled with a golden touch, and where the true story of abundance hides a much darker secret. We will meet the king of bountiful harvests. And so, having witnessed the heroic kings of Galar, Zacian and Zamazenta, those divine warriors who rose from the ancient earth to defend the land against the infinite hunger of Eternatus, we now turn deeper into that same frozen north, to a corner of Galar that holds a story far older than the darkest day. A story about a king who ruled not through sword and shield, but through the slow, patient magic of growth itself. This is the Crown Tundra, a land of perpetual frost and forgotten ruins, where the soil is so thin and the winds so bitter that one wonders how anything ever grew here at all. Yet once, long before any human set foot on these shores, this barren expanse was a bountiful paradise, a place of lush fields and abundant harvests, all because of a single Pokémon, Calyrex, the king of bountiful harvests. Calyrex is not a god of battle or of storms. It does not command the elements or shape the fabric of reality. Its power is far more subtle, far more intimate, and perhaps for that reason, far more easily forgotten. Calyrex is a being of pure, benevolent life force, a ruler whose dominion was once the fertile soil, the ripening crops, the gentle rain that fell at just the right moment. In the ancient history of the Crown Tundra, before the glaciers crept down from the poles, Calyrex reigned over a kingdom of plenty. The land was warm, the harvests were generous, and the people who lived there, if there were any, would have known their king not by its crown, but by the abundance that surrounded them. But here is the central tragedy of Calyrex. Its power is intrinsically tied to the belief and memory of its people. Unlike Arceus, whose existence seems independent of mortal recognition, or the Tapu, who draw strength from the rituals and reverence of the islanders, Calyrex's ability to maintain the prosperity of its domain depended directly on the community's conscious gratitude and remembrance. In the beginning, the people of the Crown Tundra knew exactly who was responsible for their good fortune. They celebrated Calyrex, honoured it with festivals, offered thanks for every harvest, and in return, Calyrex blessed the land with its radiant energy. It was a perfect symbiosis. The king gave, the people remembered, and the land thrived. But memory is fragile, and gratitude is often the first thing forgotten in times of plenty. As generations passed, the people of the Crown Tundra grew complacent. They began to attribute the bounty to their own hard work, to the natural richness of the soil, to luck. They no longer looked to the sky for Calyrex's blessing. They no longer told their children the stories of the Harvest King. The rituals faded. The festivals became mere customs without meaning. And the belief that had nourished Calyrex's power began to wither. And when belief fades, so too does the god that depends on it. Calyrex, sensing the erosion of its people's faith, felt its own strength draining. The fields that had once been lush became thin and pale. The rains grew erratic. The winters lengthened. The land began to mirror the king's fading vitality. In desperation, Calyrex tried to reach out, to remind the people of its presence. But they had already turned their minds to other things, to survival, to conflict, to the hard business of living in a world that no longer felt blessed. The bond between God and people was broken, and then something remarkable happened. Calyrex did not simply disappear or retreat into a hidden realm like so many forgotten gods. Instead, it found a different kind of salvation. It sought out a partner, a creature of the land itself, one that embodied the very principles of natural harmony that Calyrex had once nurtured. This partner was a magnificent steed, a Pokémon of immense strength and grace. Glastria, the wild horse of frozen fields, or Spectria, the phantom of shadow and mist. Together, they formed a bond that transcended the need for human belief. The bond between the steed and the rider became a metaphor for the harmony of nature, the perfect balance of power and purpose. Calyrex, mounted upon its chosen steed, no longer required the devotion of an entire population to sustain its divine energy. Instead, the partnership provided a new source of vitality, one rooted in mutual trust and the shared task of guarding the land. The steed gave Calyrex the strength to endure, and Calyrex gave the steed purpose and direction. They became a single creature of legend, a fusion of royal authority and wild vitality, a king who ruled not from a throne, but from the back of a living symbol of the natural world. Yet even with this bond, Calyrex could not undo the damage that had been done. The humans of the Crown Tundra had forgotten their king completely. The fertile fields had become the frozen tundra we know today. The prosperity was lost, not because Calyrex willed it, but because the people had stopped believing in the source of that prosperity. The land reflects the spirit of its caretakers, and when the caretakers abandon their reverence, the land grows cold. So Calyrex retreated deep into the heart of the Crown Tundra, waiting in a quiet, patient slumber. Its legend became a whisper, then a rumour, then nothing at all. The ruins that dot the region are all that remain of the civilization that once celebrated the Harvest King. Crumbled stone circles, moss-covered altars, inscriptions that no one can read. The people who live there now, the descendants of those who forgot, see the tundra as a harsh, unforgiving place, never knowing that it was once a paradise nurtured by a god they chose to forget. And this is the lesson of Calyrex, a lesson that echoes through all of Pokémon's forgotten gods. Divinity is not self-sustaining. It requires witness. It requires remembrance. When a god is forgotten, it does not die, but it does fade, becoming a shadow of its former self, waiting in the cold for a heart that still believes. But there are other lands, other times, where the relationship between gods and mortals took a different path. Not far from the Crown Tundra, across the sea and into the past, lies a region known as Hisui, a wild, untamed frontier where the old gods were not so easily forgotten, where the clans still remembered and feared the powers that shaped the world. And in that ancient wilds, a new story was about to unfold, one that would redefine what it meant to be chosen by a god. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let Calyrex silence settle around you, like snow falling on a forgotten field, and rest in the knowledge that even in sleep, the king still watches over its frozen domain. We left Calyrex in the Crown Tundra, a king whose power was inseparable from the memory of his people, a god who faded when belief faltered. That story of a deity bound to the perception of its followers is a thread that runs deep through Pokémon's Theology, but nowhere is it more raw, more primal, than in the ancient wilds of Hisui. This is the land before Sinnoh, before the great cities of Jubilife and the gleaming towers of the modern region. This is a frontier where the line between legend and survival is drawn in the frost of a mountain pass, and where the gods are not distant statues in a museum, but forces felt in every rustling leaf and every trembling shadow. To understand Hisui is to strip away everything you know about the Sinnoh of the present day. There are no Pokédexes here, no digital encyclopedias that reduce a Pokémon to a set of stats and a habitat entry. Instead, there is only the raw, unfiltered experience of encountering something beyond human comprehension. The lack of that scientific framework led to a worldview that was deeply superstitious and profoundly reverent. Every Pokémon was a potential spirit, a messenger, or a threat. A Luxray was not just an electric type with keen eyesight. It was a guardian of the forests, a creature whose gaze could see into your soul. A Garchomp was not a pseudo-legendary with a high attack stat. It was a living Typhnoscales and Fury, a dragon that could tear a village apart if angered. This was a world where fear and worship were the same emotion, and where the unknown was not something to be catalogued, but something to be appeased. And at the heart of this fearful frontier stood the most terrifying unknown of all, the being they called Almighty Sinnoh. But here is where the story fractures, because the people of Hisui did not agree on what that name meant. They were divided into two great clans, Diamond Clan and the Pearl Clan, and their entire cosmology, their entire understanding of creation, rested on a single fundamental disagreement. For the Diamond Clan, Almighty Sinnoh was the being who governs time. For the Pearl Clan, Almighty Sinnoh was the being who governs space. This was not a minor theological quibble. It was the central conflict of their existence. It shaped how they viewed the world, how they raised their children, and how they prayed to the heavens. The Diamond Clan saw the world as a river, a flow of moments that could be honored through patience and ritual. The Pearl Clan saw the world as a vast, interconnected expanse, a structure to be respected through precision and order. Both were right, and both were wrong, because the truth was far more complex than either clan could have imagined. The truth, as you might suspect, is that Almighty Sinnoh was not one being but two. Dialga and Palkia, the twin pillars of reality, were the forces that the clans had been worshipping all along, each through a different lens. But in the primitive wilds of Hisui, there was no one to explain this. There was no professor with a laptop and a theory. There was only the land itself, and the stories passed down through generations. The clans did not have the luxury of scientific certainty. They had only faith, and faith is a fragile thing when the world is constantly trying to kill you. The nobles of the region, the mighty Pokémon like Cleaver and Lilligant, were seen as divine envoys, beings touched by the power of Almighty Sinnoh. To calm them was to honor the gods. To fail was to invite catastrophe. And then a stranger arrived, a human, thrown from the sky, carrying a strange device that glowed with a light that seemed to come from another world. This was the player, the so-called divine messenger, sent by Arceus itself to bridge the gap between the clans and the truth. It is a fascinating role, because you are not a hero in the traditional sense. You are not a conqueror. You are a translator, a diplomat, a living bridge between a people who have forgotten the whole and a creator who remembers everything. Arceus did not send you to fight its children. It sent you to reconcile them, to show the Diamond Clan that time is meaningless without space, and to show the Pearl Clan that space is empty without time. You were the one who had to walk into the Temple of Sinnoh, not with a sword, but with an open hand, ready to heal a schism that had lasted for centuries. This is the genius of the Hisui mythos. It takes the grand, cosmic creation story of Sinnoh and filters it through the lens of a primitive, fearful frontier. The gods are not reduced. They are made more immediate. You do not simply catch Dialga and Palkia in a ball. You earn the right to stand before them, to understand why they were worshipped, and to prove that you are worthy of the trust that Arceus has placed in you. The ancient wilds of Hisui are not a place of nostalgia. They are a reminder that before there were Pokédexes and gym battles, there was only the raw, terrifying, beautiful relationship between humans and the forces that created them. And that relationship, that fragile connection between a people and their gods, is about to take a new shape, because the story of Hisui does not end with the clans united. It ends with the revelation that the creator itself is watching, waiting, and testing. The next chapter of this journey will take us deeper into the lineage of the divine, into the bloodlines and the chosen ones who carry the will of Arceus into the future. The Noble Lineage is about to be revealed, and it is a lineage that stretches far beyond the borders of Hisui, into the very fabric of what it means to be a Pokémon, and what it means to be a god. The Diamond and Pearl clans of Hisui looked to the sky with fear and reverence, believing the space-time rift was a punishment from Almighty Sinnoh. But their understanding of divine will was filtered through a much older, more intimate system of belief. Before the rift tore open the heavens, the people of Hisui lived in a world where the gods walked among them, not as distant cosmic entities, but as living, breathing creatures of flesh and fury. These were the noble Pokémon, and their story is the story of how to worship the land elves. The concept of divine favor in Hisui was not a matter of prayer alone, it was a matter of blood. The noble Pokémon were not chosen at random. They were the descendants of the original partners of the ancient hero, the first humans to tame the wilds of this frontier. When the hero and his Pokémon calmed the raging titans of the region, those titans did not simply vanish. They passed their power and their duty down through their lineage, creating a sacred bloodline. Each generation of Clever, each generation of Arcanine, each generation of Lilligant, Gudra, Electrode and Avalugg was born into a covenant. They were not just powerful creatures, they were holy avatars of the land itself, living embodiments of the mountains, the forests, the seas, and the storms. To the people of the Diamond and Pearl clans, these nobles were the face of the divine. When the harvest was good, it was because the noble of the meadow had blessed the fields. When the rivers ran clear, it was because the noble of the coast had kept the waters pure. But when the land grew angry, when the earth shook, or the skies turned black, the people did not look to the heavens. They looked to the nobles, and they saw that the nobles themselves had become angry. The ritual of offerings was the central act of worship in Hisui. Each clan maintained a sacred shrine for their local noble, a place where the warden would present gifts of food, gems, and rare materials. These offerings were not mere tokens of gratitude, they were a contract. The people gave of their labor and their wealth, and in return the noble maintained the balance of the land. But when the space-time rift first appeared, that balance shattered. The nobles began to change. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural crimson light. Their movements became erratic, violent, and uncontrollable. They were no longer guardians. They were frenzied nobles, and their rage was a physical manifestation of the gods' anger. The tragedy of this moment is that the people of Hisui did not understand what they were seeing. They believed the nobles were punishing them for some forgotten transgression. The wardens, the closest humans to these divine beings, could only watch in horror as their lifelong companions turned against them. They offered more gifts, more prayers, more desperate rituals, but the frenzy only deepened. The people did not realize that the nobles were not the source of the anger. They were victims of it. The space-time rift was not a punishment from Almighty Sinnoh. It was a wound in reality, a tear in the fabric of time and space itself. And that wound was poisoning the very essence of the noble bloodlines. The nobles were not punishing humanity. They were crying out in pain. Their frenzy was a fever, a sickness born from the distortion of the world around them. The crimson light in their eyes was not divine wrath. It was the corruption of the rift, a force that twisted their instincts and turned their sacred duty into a curse. The people of Hisui, in their fear, misinterpreted everything. They saw the frenzy as a judgment, when in truth, it was a plea for help. This misunderstanding shaped the entire history of the region. The clans turned inward, blaming each other for the calamity. The Diamond Clan believed the Pearl Clan had offended the nobles with their rituals. The Pearl Clan believed the Diamond Clan had broken the covenant through their greed. And all the while, the nobles suffered, trapped in a cycle of rage and confusion, unable to communicate their true agony. The story of the Noble Lineage is not a story of divine punishment. It is a story of a broken connection between the people and their gods. The bloodlines that had once been the source of blessing became the vessels of a curse, and the only way to restore the balance was not through more offerings or more prayers. It was through understanding. The people had to learn that the gods were not angry, they were sick, and they needed a healer, not a supplicant. This revelation would come to define the relationship between humanity and divinity in Hisui, but it would also raise a deeper question. If the nobles could be corrupted by a wound in space and time, what else could be corrupted? What other ancient powers lay dormant in the land, waiting for the right moment to awaken? The answer to that question lies not in the blood of the nobles, but in the very plates that recorded the will of the original one. The enigma of the plates would soon reveal that the gods of Hisui were not the only ones whose story had been written in stone. The Noble Lineage showed us how divine favor could be passed through bloodlines, how the people of Hisui saw the holy in the everyday, in the guardians who protected their settlements, and the lords who ruled their wilds. But those were local gods, regional powers tied to a specific land and a specific people. There is another layer to this mythology, one that reaches far beyond any single region, one that speaks to the very fabric of reality itself. This is the layer of the plates, scattered across the world, buried in ancient ruins, hidden in the depths of caves, preserved in the collections of scholars who do not fully understand what they hold, are the Arceus plates. They are not merely artifacts, they are inscriptions. And those inscriptions, when decoded, reveal something staggering about the nature of the Pokémon universe. The plates are the DNA of creation. Think about what DNA does. It is a code, a set of instructions that determines the form and function of every living thing. It is the blueprint for life itself. The plates function in exactly the same way, but on a cosmic scale. Each plate is inscribed with a symbol, a pattern of energy that corresponds to one of the 18 elemental types. The flame plate holds the essence of fire. The splash plate holds the essence of water. The meadow plate holds the essence of grass. And on, for every type that exists in the world. But these are not just symbols. They are not mere representations. The inscriptions on the plates are the actual source code for that element in the universe. When Arceus created reality, it did not simply will fire into existence. It inscribed the concept of fire onto a plate, and that inscription became the template from which all fire would spring. Every flame that has ever burned, every ember that has ever glowed, every volcano that has ever erupted, all of it traces back to that one original inscription. This is what the ancient texts mean when they speak of the plates as the source of all elemental power. They are not amplifiers, they are not conduits, they are the origin points. To hold a plate is to hold a fragment of the original creative act. To read its inscription is to read the language that Arceus used to shape the cosmos. And this leads us to a profound realization about Arceus itself. If the plates are the DNA of the universe, and if each plate contains the essence of a single type, then what does that make the being who inscribed them? Arceus is not just a creature that happens to be powerful. Arceus is not just the strongest Pokémon. Arceus is the embodiment of all types, the unified source from which all elemental diversity flows. The plates suggest that Arceus is not a being with a type. Arceus is the type itself in its primordial, undivided form. Think about how other legendary Pokémon relate to their elements. Groudon is the embodiment of land, but it is still a ground type. Kyogre is the embodiment of the sea, but it is still a water type. They are powerful expressions of their element, but they are still limited by it. Arceus, through the plates, can become any type, can access any element, because all elements are merely fragments of its original wholeness. The plates are not accessories. They are the pieces of Arceus that were scattered across creation so that the world could exist in its diverse, vibrant form. This is why the plates are so mysterious, so sought after, and so dangerous. To decode their inscriptions is to understand the fundamental language of reality. It is to see the blueprint that underlies every rock, every river, every gust of wind, every spark of electricity. And there are those who believe that by gathering all the plates, by reassembling the complete set inscriptions, one could theoretically reverse the creative act. One could collapse all the diversity of the universe back into its original, unified state. But there is another mystery hidden in the ancient texts, one that is even more unsettling. Among the stories of creation, among the hymns to the original one, there are whispers of a conflict. The texts speak of a giant, a being of immense power and fury, who rose up and fought the Creator. The details are fragmentary, almost erased from history, but the implication is clear. Arceus was not the only power in the primordial chaos. There was something else. Something that opposed the act of creation. Something that had to be overcome. Who was this giant? Was it a being of pure destruction? A force that sought to unmake what Arceus had made? Was it a rival creator? A being with its own vision for reality? Or was it something even stranger? A remnant of a previous cycle of existence? A survivor from a universe that had already ended? The texts do not say. They only record that the giant fought the creator, and that the creator prevailed. But the giant was not destroyed. It was sealed or banished, or perhaps simply forgotten. And now, as we look at the plates, as we decode their inscriptions, and marvel at the elegance of their design, we have to wonder, are the plates only the record of creation, or are they also the prison? Is the energy that flows through them the same energy that once animated the giant? And if someone were to gather all the plates, would they be unlocking not just the secrets of the universe, but also the chains that hold something ancient and terrible at bay? The inscriptions on the plates are a language of power. They are the words that Arceus spoke to bring the world into being. But every act of creation leaves a shadow, and that shadow has a name. The ancient texts call it the Calamity of the Four, and its story is waiting to be told. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The plates of Arceus, the scattered fragments of a divine language. The very script of creation written in elemental form. But what happens when that language is twisted? When the words are not those of a creator, but the bitter, resentful echoes of a fallen civilization. In Paldea, we find a different kind of scripture, one carved not into golden tablets, but into the very fabric of human failing. Here the forgotten gods were not born from the cosmos, or from nature's raw power. They were forged in the furnace of human greed. The ruinous quartet of Paldea, Wuqian, Xianpao, Tinglu, and Qiyu, are not ancient deities in the traditional sense. They are not the architects of time or the guardians of the sea. They are something far more unsettling. They are curses given form, malevolent spirits that once inhabited ordinary objects, objects that became vessels for the darkest impulses of humanity. Each one is a testament to a specific sin, a particular flavor of corruption that seeped into the world and refused to be forgotten. Consider the story of Qiyu, the bead of ruin. It is said to be the embodiment of accumulated resentment, a dark energy that gathered over centuries within a single unassuming bead. This bead was not a weapon or a tool of power. It was a trinket, a bauble, something small and easily overlooked. But it was also a repository for every whispered grievance, every unspoken betrayal, every simmering grudge that festered in the hearts of a kingdom. The bead did not create this malice. It simply absorbed it, like a sponge soaking up poison, until the poison became its very substance. When it finally awakened, it did so not as a guardian or a guide, but as a burning, vengeful fire, a concentrated blast of all the hatred that had been poured into it. Then there is Qianpao, the Sword of Ruin. A blade once wielded by a hero or a tyrant, it matters little which, for the sword itself became the symbol of a terrible truth. It was not the metal that was cursed, but the ambition that had gripped it. The sword was a tool of control, of domination, of a will that sought to bend the world to its own design. Over time, that will, that unyielding desire for power, became a living thing within the steel. It grew cold, not with the chill of winter, but with the absolute zero of a heart that had forgotten warmth. When Qianpao was unleashed, it did not seek to conquer. It sought to freeze, to still, to silence everything that moved, because movement itself was a threat to its perfect, tyrannical order. Tinglu, the Vessel of Ruin, is perhaps the most tragic. It is a massive, ancient container, a vessel that was meant to hold something precious, perhaps grain or water for a starving people, but instead it was filled with fear, the fear of a civilization on the brink of collapse, the terror of a people who saw their world crumbling around them. The vessel became a vault for that collective dread, a pressure cooker of panic that grew denser and heavier with each passing generation. When it finally broke free, it did not lash out with fire or ice. It simply became a weight, an unbearable pressure that crushed the land itself, a physical manifestation of the anxiety that had been locked inside it for so long. And finally, Woqin, the Scroll of Ruin. This is the most insidious of the four, for it represents the corruption of knowledge itself. The scroll was once a record of history, a chronicle of a kingdom's rise and fall, but history is never neutral. It is written by the victors, edited by the powerful, and buried by the ashamed. The scroll became a repository of lies, of half-truths, of the stories that a fallen empire told itself to justify its own destruction. It was a document of self-deception, and that deception festered into a sentient miasma. Woqin does not attack with brute force. It spreads a creeping decay, a rot of the mind, a confusion that makes truth and falsehood indistinguishable. It is the god of forgotten history, but not the kind that is lost to time. It is the kind that was deliberately erased, and the anger of that erasure became a living poison. What makes these four beings so profoundly dark is that they are not divine in the sense of being beyond human understanding. They are divine precisely because they are so deeply, terribly human. They are the gods of our own worst impulses, the deification of greed, resentment, ambition, and fear. They were not created by a cosmic event or a primordial force. They were created by people, by us. And that is a far more uncomfortable truth than any story of a creator deity. The ancient Chaldean Empire, the civilization that once thrived in this land, did not fall to an invading army or a natural disaster. It fell to itself. Its own greed, its own malice, its own insatiable hunger for more. These were the cracks that widened until the entire structure collapsed. And in that collapse, the four treasures, the four objects that had absorbed the Empire's sins, became something more. They became the living memory of that failure, a warning that could not be ignored. But the people who survived did not want to remember. They wanted to forget. So they sealed the treasures away, locking them in shrines hidden across the region, hoping that if they buried the past deep enough, it would never return. But the past is never truly buried. It only waits. The shrines of the ruinous quartet are not tombs. They are prisons, and every prison has a lock that can be picked. The seals were not meant to last forever. They were meant to give the world time to heal, to learn, to change. But the world did not change. The same greed, the same resentment, the same ambition, the same fear that created these beings still exists. It exists in every heart, in every society, in every moment of quiet desperation. The seals are not failing because of time. They are failing because the sins that forged them are still being committed. This is the forgotten history of the fallen empire. It is a history that Paldea itself has tried to erase, to rewrite, to pretend never happened. The empire is not a proud memory. It is a cautionary tale, a scar on the land that the people have learned to ignore. But the scars are still there. The land remembers. The shrines remember. And the four treasures, the cursed objects that became gods, remember everything. They represent a dark divinity, a power born not from the light of creation, but from the shadow of destruction. They are not gods of nature, like Groudon or Kyogre, who embody the raw forces of the planet. They are gods of the human soul, the parts of us we try to hide, the emotions we pretend we do not feel. They are the proof that divinity is not always benevolent, that the sacred can be twisted into the profane, and that the most powerful forces in the universe are not the ones that create worlds, but the ones that tear them apart. And yet, even in this darkness, there is a strange kind of reverence. The Ruinous Quartet are not evil in the way that a villain is evil. They are consequences. They are the natural result of a world that refuses to learn from its mistakes. They are the gods we deserve, not the gods we wish for. And as long as we continue to hoard, to resent, to dominate, and to fear, they will never truly be sealed away. They will always be there, waiting in the shadows, ready to remind us of what we have done. But there is another kind of power in Paldea, one that is not born from ruin. It is a power that lies beneath the surface, a crystal core that pulses with a different kind of light. It is a mystery that the people of this region have only begun to understand, a force that may hold the key to something far greater than curses and calamities. That is the story of the Terastal Core, and it is a story that will challenge everything we think we know about the nature of divinity itself. The Ruinous Quartet of Paldea were born from human emotion, from greed and malice that seeped into treasures and twisted them into curses given form. But beneath the surface of that same region, buried in the heart of a crater that defies all natural law, there is a power that predates human sin entirely, a power that may predate the planet itself. At the center of the great crater of Paldea, where the air shimmers with an energy that cannot be explained by any known science, there lies a creature that has slept for eons, Terapagos. Its name is whispered in the oldest texts of the region, though few have ever seen it, and fewer still have understood what it truly is. The Terastal phenomenon, that strange crystalline glow that transforms Pokémon into glittering, gem-like forms, radiates outward from this single being, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The great crater is not a simple hole in the earth. It is a wound in the world, a place where the boundary between what is real and what is possible becomes thin. The energy that leaks from its depths is not elemental in the way fire or water are elemental. It is something more fundamental, more primal. It is the raw stuff of existence, the building blocks of reality itself, given form and colour and light. And Terapagos sits at the very bottom of that wound, dreaming. The people of Paldea have always known about the Terastal phenomenon, but they have misunderstood its origin. They thought it was a natural property of the region, a quirk of geography or geology. They built their entire battle system around it, capturing Pokémon and forcing them to crystallize, to take on a new type, to shine with borrowed power. They never stopped to ask where that power came from. They never wondered what was sleeping beneath their feet. But the ancient texts of the region tell a different story. They speak of a disc, an indigo disc, that was not made by human hands. This disc is said to contain the very essence of Terapagos, a fragment of its power that was separated from the whole and hidden away. The disc is not a weapon. It is not a tool. It is a key, a piece of a puzzle that, if assembled, would unlock something far greater than any trainer has ever imagined. The connection between the indigo disc and the fundamental energy of the planet is not metaphorical, it is literal. Terapagos is not merely a Pokémon that happens to produce a strange energy. Terapagos is the source of that energy, the engine that drives the Terastal phenomenon. And the Terastal phenomenon is itself a reflection of something deeper. When a Pokémon terastalizes, it is not simply changing its type. It is tapping into the primal energy that underlies all of reality, the same energy that Arceus used to shape the universe from chaos. The crystals that form around a terastalized Pokémon are not decorations. They are fragments of the original stuff of creation. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. Is Terapagos a god, or is it a biological engine that powers the reality of Paldea? The answer may be both, it may be neither. In the world of Pokémon, the line between divinity and biology has always been blurred. Arceus is both a creature that can be caught and battled, and the creator of all existence. Dialga is both a Pokémon and the embodiment of time itself. Terapagos follows this same tradition, but it does so in a way that feels different, more grounded, more ancient. Terapagos does not seem to have a will in the way that Arceus does. It does not speak, does not command, does not demand worship. It simply exists, and in existing, it generates the energy that makes the terrestrial phenomenon possible. It is less a god in the sense of a conscious ruler, and more a god in the sense of a natural force, like gravity or electromagnetism. It does not choose to bless or curse. It simply is, and its being shapes the world around it. The Area Zero expedition, the journey into the heart of the Great Crater, was not just a scientific mission. It was a descent into myth, a journey backward through time, to a point where the boundaries between legend and reality had not yet been drawn. The creatures that live in Area Zero are not like the Pokémon found anywhere else on the surface. They are paradoxes, beings that seem to exist outside of time. Creatures that should not exist together but do. Some of them resemble Pokémon from the distant past, ancient forms that were thought to be extinct. Others look like they come from a future that has not yet happened, designs that are almost mechanical, almost alien, and yet they all exist together in the same place, in the same moment, as if time itself has collapsed in the crater. This blurring of time, paradox and myth is not accidental. It is a direct consequence of Terapagos's presence. The energy that radiates from the creature does not just power terrestrialization, it warps the fabric of reality, creating pockets where the normal rules of causality do not apply. In Area Zero, the past and the future are not separate. They are layers, stacked on top of each other, and sometimes those layers bleed through. The paradox Pokémon are not mistakes of nature. They are glimpses of what was and what will be, brought together by the dreaming mind of a creature that exists outside of time. The indigo disc, when it is finally reunited with Terapagos, does not simply activate a new power, it completes a circuit. The disc is a piece of Terapagos that was separated from the whole, perhaps deliberately, perhaps by accident, and when it is returned, the creature awakens fully for the first time in millennia, and in that awakening, the Terastal phenomenon is not just amplified, it is revealed for what it truly is, a window into the fundamental structure of reality, a glimpse of the raw energy that underlies all of existence. But what does this mean for the people of Paldea? What does it mean for the world? If Terapagos is truly the engine that powers the reality of the region, then every time a trainer terrestrializes their Pokémon, they are drawing directly from that engine. They are using the power of a sleeping god to win battles. They are tapping into the primal energy of creation for sport. And the question that lingers, the question that the game never fully answers, is whether this is sustainable, whether Terapagos will always sleep, whether the energy it provides is infinite, or whether it is a finite resource that is slowly being drained. The ancient texts that mention the indigo disc also speak of a balance, a harmony that must be maintained. They warn against taking too much from the crater, against disturbing the creature at its heart. But the modern world of Paldea has forgotten those warnings. They have built a society around the terrestrial phenomenon, a culture of competition and spectacle that depends on the energy of a sleeping god, and they have no idea what will happen when that god finally wakes up. The Area Zero expedition was a step into the unknown, journey that revealed more questions than answers. It showed that the myths of Paldea are not just stories. They are history, distorted by time but still true. It showed that the Terastal phenomenon is not a natural feature of the region. It is a gift, or perhaps a loan, from a creature that exists beyond the normal categories of life. And it showed that the boundaries between past and future, between myth and reality, between god and machine, are not as solid as we like to believe. Terastal is not the first creature to blur these lines, and it will not be the last. The world of Pokémon is filled with beings that defy easy classification, that exist at the edges of what we understand. But Terastal is unique in one respect. It is not a god that demands worship. It is not a force that seeks destruction or creation. It is simply a presence, a source, a core. And in that simplicity, it may be the most mysterious of all. The energy that flows from the great crater, the light that crystallizes around Pokémon in battle, the paradoxes that walk the depths of Area Zero, all of it traces back to one creature, Terastal, the Terastal Core, the hidden origin of a phenomenon that has shaped an entire region. And as the story of Paldea continues to unfold, as new expeditions descend into the crater and new discoveries are made, the question remains, what else is sleeping beneath the surface? What other forgotten gods are waiting to be found? The weather genies of Unova, the forces of nature that roam the skies and shape the storms. They too have a story that has been largely forgotten, but that is a tale for another time. For now, the Terastal Core glows in the darkness, and the world of Paldea continues to draw its power from a dream. The previous chapter ended with Terastal, a being so deeply tied to the fundamental energy of the planet that its very existence seemed to rewrite the rules of reality. But if Terastal represents the core, the hidden engine of the world, then what of the forces that move across its surface? What of the winds that shape the seasons, the storms that break the drought, and the rains that bring life back to the earth? There is a quartet of beings, ancient and wild, who have been worshipped as gods of the sky and the soil. For as long as humans have looked up and wondered, they are the forces of nature, and their story is one of transformation, of forgotten cycles, and of a goddess who was erased from memory. The first of these beings is Tornadus, the god of the storm winds. In its purest, most primal form, Tornadus appears as a muscular, green-skinned humanoid figure, its body covered in white clouds, its arm ending in massive fists that can summon gales with a single punch. This is the incarnate form, the form that ancient people saw when they looked to the sky and prayed for rain or feared the coming hurricane. Tornadus is pure, untamed motion. It is the wind that tears roofs from houses, and the breeze that carries the scent of the sea across a continent. Its presence is felt in the sudden shift of pressure before a storm, in the howl that rattles window frames, and in the stillness that follows destruction. But Tornadus is not alone. There is Thunderous, the god of lightning, and the electric charge that splits the sky. In its incarnate form, Thunderous is a blue-skinned giant, its body crackling with yellow energy, its face twisted in a perpetual snarl of rage or joy. It carries a long, whip-like tail that can summon thunderbolts with a flick. Where Tornadus is the wind, Thunderous is the flash, the roar, the sudden illumination of a dark world. Ancient cultures saw it as both a destroyer and a purifier, a being that could burn away the old to make way for the new. Lightning strikes are terrifying, but they also fertilize the soil with nitrogen, a secret gift hidden in the heart of destruction. And then there is Landorus, the third of the original trio, and perhaps the most revered of them all. In its incarnate form, Landorus appears as a red-skinned humanoid with a flowing white mane, its body covered in brown earth tones. It is the god of the land itself, the force that brings fertility to the fields and abundance to the harvest. But Landorus is not a gentle god. It is the power that shapes mountains, that carves canyons, and that shakes the earth with its passing. Ancient farmers would pray to Landorus for a good harvest, but they also feared its wrath. If the winds of Tornadus and the storms of Thunderous became too wild, it was Landorus who would descend to calm them, to restore balance to the cycle. These three beings were worshipped across the Unova region and beyond, their names spoken in the same breath as the seasons themselves. Spring was the time of Thunderous, when the first storms of the year broke the winter's grip. Summer was the reign of Tornadus, when the winds grew hot and restless. Autumn was the season of Landorus, when the harvest was brought in and the land prepared for rest. The cycle was simple, predictable, and sacred. But there was a fourth being, one that was lost to history for centuries. A goddess whose name was whispered only in the oldest of texts, and whose image was erased from temples and shrines. That goddess is Enigma, the hidden force of nature, the embodiment of love, compassion, and the generative power of the spring. In its incarnate form, Enigma appears as a pink-skinned humanoid with a flowing white dress, its face framed by a heart-shaped crest, its hands holding a small, glowing orb of pure energy. It is the most beautiful of the four, but also the most misunderstood. Enigma is the force that drives the renewal of life, the warmth that thaws the frozen ground, the urge that pushes seeds to sprout and animals to mate. It is the gentle side of the seasonal cycle, the counterpart to the destruction wrought by its companions. But why was Enigma forgotten? The answer lies in the history of the Hisui region, the ancient land that would one day become Sinnoh. Long before the Diamond and Pearl clans built their settlements, before the first humans set foot on those shores, the forces of nature roamed freely across the world. They were not just gods of the seasons, they were the seasons themselves, their moods and movements dictating the rhythm of life. But Enigma was different. It did not simply bring the spring. It embodied the very concept of connection, of the bonds that tie living things together. And in a world that was harsh and unforgiving, that softness was seen as a weakness. The ancient peoples of Hisui, the ancestors of the clans, knew of Enigma. They carved its image into stone and offered prayers to it during the planting season. But as time passed, as the world grew colder and the winters longer, the memory of Enigma faded. The other three forces of nature were easier to understand. Tornadus was the wind that could be seen and felt. Thunderous was the lightning that could be counted and feared. Landorus was the earth that could be touched and tilled. But Enigma was an abstraction, a feeling, a promise of warmth that could not be held. And so it was slowly erased from the collective memory. Its name struck from the records, its statues toppled and buried. But Enigma did not disappear. It retreated, waiting for a time when the world would be ready to remember it. And that time came with the events of the Hisui region, when the player character, a traveller from a distant future, began to uncover the lost history of the land. In the ancient ruins and forgotten texts of Hisui, the name of Enigma was found again, carved into stone tablets and woven into the songs of the old peoples. It was a revelation that changed everything. The cycle of the seasons was not a trio, it was a quartet. The spring had always had a goddess, and she had been waiting for someone to call her back. The rediscovery of Enigma also shed new light on the transformation that the forces of nature undergo. You see, these beings are not fixed in their forms. They possess a second shape, a Therian form, which is a reflection of their true nature as wild, untamed spirits of the natural world. The incarnate forms are the shapes they take when they interact with humans, a compromise between their divine power and the limited perception of mortal eyes. But the Therian forms are their true selves, the forms they wear when they are free to be nothing but the forces they represent. In its Therian form, Tornadus becomes a massive avian creature, a bird of pure storm cloud, its wings spanning the horizon, its body a swirling mass of wind and rain. It is no longer a humanoid god. It is the storm itself, a living hurricane that moves across the sky with no regard for the world below. Thundurus transforms into a serpentine dragon of pure electricity, its body a crackling line of blue-white energy, its roar the sound of thunder that shakes the mountains. It is the lightning-given form, a creature that exists only in the instant between the flash and the boom. Landorus, in its Therian form, becomes a great tiger-like beast, its body made of stone and earth. It stripes the patterns of fertile soil and barren rock. It is the land itself, the power that shapes continents and feeds the roots of forests. And Enigma, in its Therian form, becomes a graceful serpentine creature, its body flowing like water, its wings the colours of a spring sunrise. It is the gentle breeze that carries the scent of flowers, the warmth that melts the snow, the promise of new life. The transition between these forms, is not a simple transformation. It is a release, a shedding of the human-like guise that allows these beings to communicate with mortals. When a force of nature takes its Therian form, it is no longer a god that can be reasoned with. It is a force of nature, pure and simple. It is the wind, the lightning, the earth, and the spring. And in that form, it is both more powerful and more dangerous, because it is no longer bound by the rules of human understanding. The cycle of fertility and destruction brought by the shifting winds is a delicate balance. Tornadous and thunderous bring the storms that can flood fields and tear down homes, but they also bring the rain that nourishes the crops. Landorus brings the earth that can shake and crack, but it also brings the soil that feeds the world. And Enigma brings the warmth that can melt the ice and awaken the dormant seeds. But it also brings the chaos of new growth, the untamed energy of life itself. The forces of nature are not good or evil. They are the seasons, and the seasons are both cruel and kind. In the modern era, the forces of nature are still worshipped in some remote corners of the world, but their cults are small and secretive. The great temples that once stood in their honor have crumbled to dust, and the rituals that once called them forth are remembered only by a few, but they are not forgotten. They are still there, in the howl of the wind, in the flash of lightning, in the feel of soil beneath your feet, and in the first warm day of spring. They are the forgotten weather genies, the gods of the sky and the earth, and they are waiting. And as we close this chapter on the winds that shape the world, we must turn our gaze to another kind of power, one that is not born of storms or seasons, but of wishes and dreams. The next chapter will explore the beings that exist on the edge of myth and reality, the wishmakers and the mythics, whose very existence is a question of faith and desire. What does it mean to wish upon a star? And what happens when that wish takes form and walks among us? The answer lies in the story of a being that sleeps for 1,000 years, and the power that awakens when hope is all that remains. The forces of nature we explored in the last chapter are raw, untamed expressions of the world's seasonal pulse. They are storms and soil, wind and growth, and they exist in a realm of constant cyclical change. But there is another class of being in the Pokémon world, one that does not command the weather or shape the continents. These beings are smaller, quieter, and infinitely more elusive. They do not rule over ecosystems or guard ancient temples. Instead, they govern the most fragile and unpredictable forces in the universe: luck, victory, and the very flow of time itself. They are the mythicals, and among them, 3 stand apart as the small gods. Jirachi, Victini, and Celebi are not forces of nature in the way that Groudon or Kyogre are. They do not embody a primal element like fire or water. Instead, they represent concepts that are deeply human, almost abstract. Jirachi is the wishmaker, the embodiment of hope and desire. Victini is the victory bringer, the spirit of triumph and success. And Celebi is the time traveler, the guardian of the forest, and the weaver of past, present, and future. These 3 are often grouped together in the minds of lore enthusiasts because they share a peculiar trait. They are almost never seen by the general public. They are kept as secrets, whispered about in ancient texts, and passed down through oral traditions. But why? Why would beings of such benevolent power be hidden away? The answer lies in the nature of what they govern. Luck, victory, and time are not stable forces. They are fleeting, capricious, and deeply personal. A wish granted by Jirachi is not a permanent change to the world. It is a momentary alignment of possibility, a brief window where the universe bends to the will of the dreamer. Victory, as embodied by Victini, is not a state of being. It is a spark, a surge of confidence that can turn a battle or a life, but it cannot be hoarded. And time, under the care of Celebi, is not a straight line. It is a tangled, branching river, and any interference with it can have consequences that ripple across centuries. These beings are not meant to be worshipped in temples or called upon in times of crisis. They are meant to be encountered by chance, by fate, by the rarest of circumstances. Consider Jirachi, the star of wishes. Its most defining characteristic is its 1,000-year slumber. For 999 years, Jirachi lies dormant, curled within a crystalline cocoon, dreaming of the wishes it will one day grant. It is said that Jirachi awakens for only 7 days every 1,000 years, and during that brief window, it can read the hearts of those who find it and make their deepest desires come true. This is not a myth meant to inspire hope. It is a metaphor for the fleeting nature of miracles. 1,000 years of sleep for 7 days of action. The message is clear. True miracles are rare, and they require patience, faith, and the willingness to wait for an event that may never come in your lifetime. The ancient peoples who first documented Jirachi understood this. They did not build shrines to it or attempt to summon it with rituals. They simply recorded its existence and passed down the knowledge of its awakening, trusting that future generations would recognize the moment when the stars aligned. Victini, the victory Pokémon, operates on a similar principle, though its mythology is more tied to the concept of shared triumph. Victini is said to bring victory to any trainer who befriends it. But this is not a passive blessing. Victini's power is rooted in its ability to create an infinite amount of energy within itself, a limitless well of potential that it can share with others. In the Unova region, where Victini's legend is strongest, it is often depicted as a bringer of hope during times of war or hardship. But here is the crucial detail: Victini does not choose sides. It does not guarantee victory for the righteous or the strong. It simply amplifies the will to win in whoever it bonds with. This makes it a dangerous being to possess, because victory without wisdom can lead to destruction. The ancient kings of Unova understood this, and they kept Victini hidden away on a remote island, accessible only to those who proved themselves worthy of its power. The public was never told the full truth. They were given stories of a mythical Pokémon that could grant victory, but the location of its resting place was erased from maps and memory. Then there is Celebi, the voice of the forest. Celebi is unique among the small gods because it does not sleep for centuries or hide on an isolated island. It travels through time, appearing in different eras, always connected to the life force of the forests it protects. Celebi's power is the most profound and the most dangerous. It can heal wounds, restore life to dead plants, and even prevent catastrophic events by altering the timeline. But time travel is not a gift, it is a responsibility. Celebi is often depicted as a playful, childlike creature, but its role is that of a cosmic guardian. It ensures that the flow of time remains stable, that the past and future are not torn apart by reckless interference. This is why Celebi is so rarely seen. It does not want to be found. It moves through history like a ghost, appearing only when the balance of time is threatened. The few humans who have encountered Celebi often describe it as a fleeting vision, a shimmer of green light in the deep woods, gone before they can even reach out a hand. The difference between a legendary and a mythical is subtle but essential. Legendary Pokémon are forces of nature. They are the embodiment of concepts like time, space, land, sea, and sky. They are predictable in their power, even if they are rare. You can study them, categorize them, and understand their place in the cosmic order. Mythical Pokémon, on the other hand, are wonders. They are not bound by the same rules. They exist outside the normal hierarchy of the world, appearing only when the conditions are perfect, and disappearing just as quickly. Jirachi, Victini, and Celebi are not meant to be captured and displayed. They are meant to be experienced, and even then, only by a select few. This is why they are kept as secrets. The organizations that know of their existence, the ancient scholars, and the modern researchers, understand that revealing the full truth about these beings would change the world in ways that cannot be undone. Imagine a world where everyone knew that a wish-granting Pokémon slept beneath a certain mountain. The rush of greed, the desperate attempts to wake it, the wars that would be fought over the right to make a wish. The small gods are hidden, not because they are weak, but because their power is too intimate, too personal, to be exposed to the masses, and so they remain in the shadows, waiting. Jirachi sleeps through the ages, its dreams echoing through the fabric of reality. Victini glows with an eternal flame on its hidden island, watching the world from afar, and Celebi weaves through the branches of time, a silent guardian of moments that have not yet been written. They are the forgotten gods, not because they have lost their power, but because they have chosen to remain unseen. But the question lingers: what happens when humanity's reach extends too far? What happens when we stop waiting for miracles and start trying to manufacture them ourselves? That is a story for another time, one that begins with a being forged not by nature or time, but by human hands and human ambition. A story about the man-made divinity. From the wishmakers and time travelers of myth, we now turn to something far stranger, something that was never born, never hatched, and never blessed by any divine hand. A being created not by nature, not by Arceus, but by human hands and human ambition. This is the story of Magyana, the man-made divinity, and the question that haunts its existence. Can a machine possess a soul? In the ancient kingdom of Azoth, long before the modern regions of the Pokémon world took shape, there existed a civilization that had mastered arts we can barely comprehend today. They were alchemists, engineers, and philosophers who believed that the gap between the mechanical and the living was not a wall, but a door waiting to be opened, and they built a key. That key was the Soul Heart, a device of impossible complexity, forged from a blend of clockwork precision and what can only be described as alchemical science. The Soul Heart was not simply a power source. It was an attempt to capture the essence of life itself, to create a vessel for consciousness, emotion, and will, to build a god from gears and metal. Magyana was the result, a Pokémon of steel and fairy, a fusion of cold machinery and warm myth. It was designed as a companion, a protector, and a symbol of the kingdom's mastery over the natural world. But it was also something more. It was a test of whether humanity could reach into the realm of the divine and pull back a spark of their own. The original Magyana, the one that still exists in the modern era, is known as the original Color Magyana. It is not a mass-produced model. It is the first, the only one ever created with the full Soul Heart intact. And its story is one of the most tragic in all of Pokémon lore. You see, Magyana was not just a machine. It was given a purpose. It was bonded to a princess of the Azoth Kingdom, a young girl who became its partner and its reason for being. The princess and Magyana were inseparable. The mechanical Pokémon was her guardian, her friend, and her confidant. It learned to feel, to care, and to protect. It developed something that the alchemists had hoped for but could never guarantee: a personality, a will of its own. But kingdoms fall, empires crumble, and the Azoth civilization faded into history, leaving behind ruins, legends, and a single forgotten mechanical princess. Magyana survived. It waited. For centuries it remained dormant, its soul heart still beating, still holding the memories of a girl who had long since turned to dust. It was found again in the modern era, reactivated by a trainer named AZ, the same ancient king who had once wielded the ultimate weapon of Kalos. And that connection is no coincidence. AZ, the tragic figure of Kalos, understood loss better than anyone. He had built a weapon to revive his fallen Pokémon, a device that blurred the line between life and death, science and miracle, and he recognized in Magyana a kindred spirit, a being created to defy the natural order, a being that existed because someone refused to accept the limits of the world. But here is where the story of Magyana becomes truly unsettling. The Soul Heart is not just a battery, it is a device that absorbs the energy of other Pokémon. In the games, the Soul Heart ability allows Magyana to increase its special attack whenever a Pokémon faints in battle. It feeds on the life force of others. It consumes their energy to sustain its own artificial existence. This is the dark underbelly of the man-made divinity. The alchemists of Azoth could not create a soul from nothing. They had to take from the living to power their creation. The Soul Heart is a parasite, a leech, a machine that thrives on death. And yet Magyana itself is not evil. It is innocent. It does not choose to be what it is. It was built that way. So where does that leave us? If a being is created by human hands, powered by stolen life, and yet capable of love, loyalty, and sorrow, does it have a soul? Or is it merely a sophisticated puppet, mimicking emotions it cannot truly feel? This question challenges the very hierarchy of the natural gods. Arceus, Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, they are beings of pure cosmic origin. They were not made. They simply are. They represent forces that existed before time and space had names. But Majana represents something else entirely. It represents the audacity of humanity to play creator, to look at the divine and say, we can do that too. And in doing so, Majana becomes a mirror. If a machine can be mistaken for a god, then what does that say about the gods themselves? Are they also creations? Are they also powered by forces beyond their control? Or is there a fundamental difference between the natural and the artificial, the born and the built? The original colour Majana is a relic of a forgotten age. It is a princess without a kingdom, a guardian without a charge, a soul without a clear origin. It wanders the world, sometimes helping trainers, sometimes retreating into solitude. It carries the weight of its own existence, a question mark given form. And yet, there is hope in its story, because Majana can still feel. It can still form bonds. It can still choose. And that choice, that capacity for love and loss, may be the closest thing to a soul that any being, organic or mechanical, can ever possess. The alchemists of Azoth may have failed to create a true god, but they succeeded in creating something perhaps more precious. They created a being that could ask the question itself, am I real? Do I matter? And in asking, it becomes real. It becomes meaningful. So as we lay here tonight, drifting towards sleep, consider the mechanical princess. Consider the gears and the soul heart, the centuries of silence, the memories of a girl long gone. Consider the possibility that divinity is not about origin. It is about purpose. It is about love. And it is about the courage to exist, even when you are not sure you should. Up next, we will explore a different kind of forgotten god, one that wears a mask and hides a terrible secret. The tale of Ogerpon and the folklore of Kitakami is a story of theft, betrayal, and the masks we all wear to protect ourselves. It is a story that asks whether a monster can be a hero, and whether a hero can be a monster. The Ogerpon Folklore awaits. From the tragedy of a mechanical princess with a stolen heart, we move to a different kind of theft, where the stolen object was not a soul, but a mask, and where the thieves were remembered as heroes, while the victim was branded a demon. This is the folklore of Kitakami, a land nestled in the mountains, isolated from the modern world, where the old stories still cling to the soil like morning mist. And in those stories, there is a monster, a terrible horned ogre who once descended upon the land, bringing destruction and sorrow. But as with all myths that survive long enough to be carved into stone, the truth is far more complicated and far more heartbreaking. The story begins with a mask, not just any mask, but a mask of immense power, carved from the wood of a sacred tree and imbued with the very essence of the land itself. This mask was a gift, a symbol of trust and partnership between a Pokémon and the people of Kitakami. That Pokémon was Ogerpon, a creature of the earth and the forest, who wore the mask not as a disguise, but as a part of her very being. She was not a god in the sense of a creator, but she was a protector, a guardian of the mountain passes and the hidden glades. The people knew her, or at least some of them did. They knew that when the harvest was good and the streams ran clear, it was because Ogerpon was watching over them. She was a spirit of the place, a living embodiment of Kitakami's wild heart. But there were others who coveted that power. 3 Pokémon, who would later be known as the Loyal 3, came to Kitakami. Their names were Okidogi, Munkidori, and Fezandipiti. They were not from this land. They were wanderers, outsiders. They saw in Ogerpon's mask a source of strength they did not possess. They saw a way to elevate themselves from mere travellers to something more, to gods perhaps, or at least to heroes. And so they devised a plan. They approached Ogerpon not as enemies, but as friends. They offered her companionship, a chance to share her burden. And in a moment of trust, Ogerpon removed her mask, the source of her power, and handed it to them. What happened next is the core of the subversion. The loyal three did not return the mask. They stole it. But they did not simply take it and flee. They donned the mask and turned its power against the very people Ogerpon had protected. They rampaged through the villages, causing chaos and destruction, all while wearing the face of the ogre. To the terrified villagers, it was Ogerpon herself who had gone mad. The protector had become the destroyer. The demon had been unleashed. And when the real Ogerpon, powerless and desperate, tried to reclaim her mask, she was met with fear and violence. The people saw her horned silhouette, and they remembered the destruction. They did not see the truth. They saw the monster they had been told to fear, and so the loyal three became the heroes. They were the ones who, according to the legend, drove the ogre away. They were the brave protectors who saved Kitakami from the demon. Statues were erected in their honor. Festivals were held to celebrate their courage. Their names were sung once, passed down through generations. They were given the title Loyal Three, a name that implies devotion and righteousness. But their loyalty was only to themselves and to the lie they had constructed. They were thieves, not just of a mask, but of a reputation, of a history, of an entire identity. Ogerpon, meanwhile, retreated. She fled to the highest peak, to a cave hidden behind a waterfall, where she could no longer be seen. She grieved. She grieved for the trust she had given, for the home she had lost, and for the people who now cursed her name. She was a protector who had been branded a demon, and she carried that weight alone. The masks that had once been her pride became her prison. She could not show her face without being hunted. She could not explain the truth, because no one would listen. The story had already been written, and she was the villain. This is where the social construction of godhood versus monstrosity becomes so clear. The loyal three were not inherently good. They were not divine. They were opportunists who used a lie to elevate themselves. But because the lie was believed, because it was repeated and ritualized, it became truth. The people of Kitakami built a religion around a deception. They prayed to thieves. They thanked the ones who had caused the destruction, and they feared the one who had tried to stop it. Godhood, in this context, was not a matter of power or virtue. It was a matter of narrative control. Whoever told the story best and told it loudest became the god. The other became the monster. But the truth was not entirely lost. It was kept alive by a few. There were whispers, passed in secret from parent to child, from elder to apprentice. Some remembered the old ways, the time before the mask was stolen. They remembered the quiet guardian who walked the forest paths and never harmed a soul. They kept the memory of Ogerpon not as a demon, but as a friend. They preserved the knowledge of the cave behind the waterfall, and they left offerings there, not out of fear, but out of love. These few were the keepers of the real story, the ones who understood that history is written by the victors, but memory belongs to the survivors. And so the folklore of Kitakami became a layered thing. On the surface, there is the official tale, the one told at festivals and carved into stone. But beneath it, like roots beneath the earth, there is another story. A story of a stolen mask, a betrayed trust, and a grieving protector who waits, even now, for someone to see past the lie. It is a story about how easily we can be fooled by a familiar face, and how hard it is to unlearn a story we have been told since childhood. The loyal three are not loyal. The demon is not a demon, and the hero, the real hero, is the one who was forgotten. This brings us to the next chapter in our exploration of forgotten gods, where we will confront a paradox that defies the very flow of time itself. In the next chapter, we will examine the paradox of time and the beings who exist outside its boundaries, waiting for the moment when the past and the future collide. The story of Ogerpon in Kitakami taught us something crucial about how Pokémon myths are written. They are not always what they seem. The loyal three were not heroes, and the ogre was not a demon. The truth was buried under generations of retelling, until a stranger from another region walked into town and uncovered the real story. That is the pattern of Pokemon's forgotten gods. They are not forgotten because they vanished. They are forgotten because the story changed around them. And in the Paldea region, that pattern takes on a far stranger, far more unsettling form. Because here, the myths are not just old stories. They are contradictions in time itself. Consider what we know about the divine timeline of the Pokémon universe. Arceus emerges from chaos. It creates Dialga, who governs time. It creates Palkia, who governs space. And then, according to the ancient texts of the Canalave Library, the world takes shape in a linear progression. Cause leads to effect. Past leads to present. Present leads to future. This is the foundation of Sinnoh's theology. It is the bedrock upon which all other myths are built. But what happens when that linear progression breaks? What happens when the past and the future begin to bleed into the present, carrying creatures that should not exist in the same era? This is the paradox at the heart of Paldea. Deep within the Great Crater, at the center of Area Zero, something has gone wrong with time itself. The Terastal phenomenon, which we explored in an earlier chapter, is not merely a crystallized energy, it is a window. And through that window, the timeline has begun to fracture. The result is a category of Pokémon that the games call Paradox Pokémon. They are not ancient beings that survived into the modern day. They are not future beings that traveled backward. They are something far more troubling. They are creatures that exist because the timeline has become uncertain. Let us examine the ancient Paradox Pokémon first. Great Tusk, Screamtail, Brute Bonnet, Fluttermane, Slitherwing, Sandy Shocks, and Roaring Moon. These are the beings that emerge from the past, or at least from what the past might have been. They resemble modern Pokémon, but they are not exact ancestors. They are primal, exaggerated, almost mythological versions of familiar species. Great Tusk is a Donphan, but it is a Donphan from a time before Donphan had a name, a time when it was a colossal, rampaging force of nature. Screamtail is a Jigglypuff, but it is a Jigglypuff from an era when its song was not a lullaby but a weapon. These are not the direct ancestors of the Pokémon we know. They are the ancestors that legend described, the ones that the fossil records cannot confirm. Now consider the future Paradox Pokémon. Iron Treads, Iron Bundle, Iron Hands, Iron Jugulis, Iron Moth, Iron Thorns, and Iron Valiant. These are the beings that emerge from what the future might hold. They are mechanical, sleek, efficient. They are the descendants of modern Pokémon, but they are not natural descendants. They are the result of a timeline where technology has consumed biology. Iron Valiant is a fusion of Gardevoir and Galad, a being that should not exist in any natural evolutionary line. Iron Jugulis is a Hydreigon that has become a drone, its 3 heads replaced with mechanical weaponry. These are not the direct descendants of the Pokémon we know. They are the descendants that science fiction predicted, the ones that no one alive today will ever see. And then there is the third legendary, the one that holds the key to this entire mystery. In the depths of Area Zero, beneath the crystal caverns and the shimmering pools of terrestrial energy, there is a being that exists outside of time entirely. Its name is Terapagos, and it is not an ancient Pokémon. It is not a future Pokémon. It is a paradox given form. Terapagos is the source of the Terastal phenomenon, the crystallized energy that allows Pokémon to change their type and access new powers. But it is also the anchor that holds the timeline together. When Terapagos is disturbed, when its energy is drawn upon too heavily, the boundaries between past and future begin to dissolve. The Paradox Pokémon are not invaders from other times. They are manifestations of the timeline's uncertainty. They are the questions that the universe is asking itself. Are they the ancestors or descendants of gods? That is the question that threatens to unravel the entire creation story of Arceus. Because if the Paradox Pokémon are real, if they are not illusions or glitches, then the timeline is not linear, it is a web. And at the center of that web, there is a being that can rewrite the past and the future simultaneously. Terapagos, in its true form, is not a legendary in the traditional sense. It is a force of narrative instability. It is the embodiment of the question that every mythologist dreads. What if the story was never true? Consider the implications for Arceus. The original one created Dialga to govern time. Dialga ensures that time flows in a single direction, that cause precedes effect, that the past is fixed and the future is unknown. But Terapagos, through the Terastal phenomenon, allows Pokémon from the past and future to exist in the present. This is not a violation of time, it is a redefinition of it. If Terapagos can pull a roaring moon from the ancient past and an Iron Valiant from the distant future into the same moment, then the timeline is not a line at all, it is a sphere. And if the timeline is a sphere, then Arceus did not create a universe with a beginning and an end. It created a universe where everything is happening at once. This is where the concept of paradox becomes a threat to theology. The Pokémon world has always treated its myths as truths, even when those truths are contradictory. The Canal of Library tells us that Arceus created Dialga and Palkia, but the Paradox Pokémon suggest that time and space are not creations, they are conditions. They are the fabric of a reality that has always been unstable. If Terapagos can exist, if it can summon beings from eras that should not touch, then the creation story is not a history, it is a hypothesis, and hypotheses can be disproven. The third legendary of Paldea, the one that the games call the hidden treasure of Area Zero, is not a god in the sense that Arceus is a god. It does not create, it does not command, it simply is. And its existence forces us to ask a question that the Pokémon franchise has never asked so directly. What if the gods themselves are not the original beings? What if they are just the first beings that we remembered? What if there were others before them? Beings that existed in a time before time had a name. And those beings are now leaking through the cracks in reality. The Paradox Pokémon are not ancestors or descendants of the gods. They are the evidence that the gods are not the whole story. They are the fossils of a timeline that never happened, the echoes of a future that may never come. And they are here, in the present, because the universe is not as orderly as the myths would have us believe. This is the crisis that Paldea presents to the divine timeline. It is not a rejection of Arceus. It is a complication of Arceus. It is the suggestion that creation is not a single event, but a continuous process. And that process is messy. It is full of false starts, dead ends, and impossible survivals. The Paradox Pokémon are the ghosts of those dead ends. They are the might-have-beens and the might-still-bees. And they are walking around in the world, breathing, fighting, existing, as if they have every right to be here. Perhaps they do. Perhaps the timeline was never as linear as we believed. Perhaps the forgotten gods are not just the ones that were sealed away or worshipped into obscurity. Perhaps they are the ones that never existed at all until the moment the timeline fractured and they became real. That is the paradox of time. It is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a truth to be accepted. And once you accept it, you begin to see the cracks everywhere. In the ruins of ancient civilizations, in the sealed chambers of forgotten temples, in the crystalline depths of a crater that should not exist. The past and the future are not separate. They are layers of the same moment, pressed together by forces that we are only beginning to understand. And in the modern world, where technology and myth are becoming indistinguishable, those layers are beginning to peel apart. The theology of the modern world is not about worshipping old gods. It is about understanding that the old gods were never finished. They are still being written, and we are living in the chapter where the ink is still wet. We ended the last chapter standing at the edge of a paradox, staring at creatures that seem to exist outside of time itself, ancient ancestors and future descendants that might not be ancestors or descendants at all, but something far stranger. And that strangeness brings us to a question that has haunted the Pokémon world since the very first generation. A question that its people have never quite been able to answer. What do you do with a god when you find one? In the modern world, from Kanto to Paldea, that question has been answered in a very specific way. You study it, you capture it, you put it in a ball, and you measure its stats. The temples and shrines that once dotted the landscape, the places where ancient peoples left offerings and whispered prayers, they have become laboratories and research stations. The priests have become professors, the rituals have become data sets, and the gods themselves have become specimens. This transition is not a clean break. It is a slow creeping shift that mirrors our own world's relationship with the divine. In Kanto, the very first region we ever visited, there is almost no overt theology at all. The legendary Pokémon exist. Mew is whispered about as the ancestor of all Pokémon, but there are no temples dedicated to it, no festivals in its honor. The people of Kanto have already moved on. They are too busy building their infrastructure, perfecting their Poké-balls, and competing in their gym challenge to worry about the primordial source of all life. Mew is a rumor, a ghost story for geneticists. Mewtwo is a fact, a product of science, a god that was not born but built. And that is the Kanto way. Power is not worshipped, power is weaponized. But then you travel to Yoto, just a short distance away, and the world feels ancient again. The burned tower still stands, its charred timbers a monument to a divine tragedy. The kimono girls still dance their ritual dances, preserving a connection to Ho-Oh and Lugia that has lasted for centuries. In Yoto, the gods are not forgotten, but they are also not quite present. They are remembered in stories, in songs, in the architecture of the city. The people know that Ho-Oh resurrected the three beasts. They know that Lugia fled to the Whirl Islands after the tower burned, but they do not expect to see them. The gods are part of the past, and the past is a sacred place you visit, not a place you live. Then Sinnoh arrived, and everything changed. Sinnoh did not just have myths. Sinnoh had a creation story. The Kanalav library contains texts that describe the birth of the universe itself, an egg emerging from chaos, a being named Arceus that shaped time and space and antimatter with its very will. This was not a local legend. This was theology, and the modern world of Sinnoh did not know what to do with it. Some people, like the members of Team Galactic, saw it as a blueprint for power. If Arceus created the universe, then controlling Arceus meant controlling reality. Cyrus did not want to worship the gods. He wanted to replace them. He wanted to unmake the world and remake it in his own image, free from the imperfections of spirit and emotion that the Lake Trio had gifted to humanity. And that is the recurring theme that runs through every generation, from Team Magma and Team Aqua in Hoenn, who tried to awaken Groudon and Kyogre to reshape the land and sea, to Team Flare in Kalos, who sought to use the ultimate weapon, powered by the life and death forces of Xerneas and Yveltal, to wipe away everyone they deemed unworthy. The evil teams of the Pokémon world are not atheists. They are the opposite. They believe in the gods so completely that they are willing to tear the world apart to get their hands on them. They are the ultimate expression of a world that has lost its reverence. They do not bow, they reach. And this brings us to the strangest question of all. Why do the gods allow themselves to be caught by 10-year-old trainers? Why does Arceus, the creator of the universe, submit to a Pokeball thrown by a child? The answer is not simple, and it is not the same for every legendary being. But if you look closely at the stories, a pattern emerges. The gods of the Pokémon world are not omnipotent in the way we think of omnipotence. They are powerful, yes, immensely powerful, but they are also bound by the rules of the world they helped create. They are forces of nature, and nature can be studied, understood, and even directed. A child who has travelled across the region, who has earned the respect of 8 gym leaders, who has formed bonds with dozens of Pokémon, that child has proven something. They have proven that they can be trusted with power. They have proven that they understand the balance. But there is another layer, a darker one. Many of these gods are not free. They are sealed. They are sleeping. They are wounded. The Regis were locked away by ancient civilizations who feared their power. Kyurem is a husk, a remnant of a being that was shattered. Necrozma is a broken light, desperate to consume and restore itself. Even Arceus, in the events of Pokémon Legends, Arceus is not acting from a place of strength. It is calling out for help, testing the player, trying to find someone worthy of its trust. The gods allow themselves to be caught because they need something. They need a champion. They need a witness. They need someone to remember them. And that is the theology of the modern world. It is a theology of forgetting. The temples crumble. The rituals become tourist attractions. The stories become children's tales. But the gods themselves do not disappear. They simply wait. They wait in the depths of the sea, in the heart of volcanoes, in the distortion of alternate dimensions, in the sealed chambers of ancient ruins. They wait for someone to find them, to understand them, to prove that humanity is still worth saving. And when that someone arrives, usually a child with a backpack and a dream, the gods do not demand worship. They do not demand sacrifice. They demand only one thing: a battle, a test of worth, a chance to be seen, truly seen for what they are. And so the cycle continues. The old gods fade and new ones rise. The ancient powers are forgotten, and then they are rediscovered. The temples become laboratories, and the prayers become data. But the mystery remains, because no matter how many Pokeballs you fill, no matter how many stats you record, no matter how many scientific papers you publish, you cannot capture the feeling of standing before a being that shaped the mountains and carved the oceans. You cannot measure the weight of a myth. You can only carry it forward. And that is where we will go next, into the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, of forgetting and remembering, of gods who fall and gods who rise again. The story of the Pokémon world is not a straight line. It is a circle. And we are about to see what happens when that circle closes. We've watched the modern world build its laboratories over ancient temples, its Pokeballs replacing the offerings once left at shrines. We've seen how science has tried to explain the unexplainable, cataloguing gods as data points and reducing divine power to energy readings. But if you've been listening closely through these chapters, you've noticed something strange. The more the world tries to forget, the more the old powers refuse to stay buried. They don't fade because they are weak. They wait because they are patient. Let's take a step back and look at the entire journey we've traced. It began with simple monsters in Kanto, creatures that were powerful but never quite divine. Mew was ancient, yes, but it was more like a genetic ancestor than a creator. The world of Generation 1 didn't have temples or hymns. It had caves and labs, and the strongest beings were just that strong. There was no theology, no cosmic weight, just a child and a journey. Then Yoto arrived, and with it, the first real religion. The burned tower wasn't just a dungeon, it was a monument to loss and resurrection. Ho-Oh didn't just fly overhead, it performed a miracle, raising 3 fallen Pokémon from ash and flame. The Kimono Girls danced in its honor. The people of Ecruteak built their lives around a story that had happened centuries before. For the first time, a Pokémon was not just a creature to catch, it was a being to revere. Hoenn deepened that reverence, but it also began the process of forgetting. The Weather Trio were world shapers, but their myths were buried under layers of archaeology. The Regis was sealed in ruins that no one remembered how to open. Jirachi slept for 1,000 years, and most people didn't even know it existed. The gods were still there, but the world had started to look away. Science was rising. Excavation teams were digging up the past, not to worship it, but to understand it. And then Sinnoh changed everything. Generation 4 didn't just introduce a god, it introduced the original god. Arceus was not a regional guardian or a natural force. It was the being that hatched from an egg in chaos and spoke time, space, and antimatter into existence. The Canalav library text gave us the first coherent creation myth. The Lake Trio weren't just powerful, they were the source of knowledge, emotion, and willpower itself. For the first time, the Pokémon world had a cosmology that rivaled any real-world religion. It had a beginning, a middle, and a sense of purpose. But even in Sinnoh, the memory was fading. The people of modern Sinnoh didn't worship Dialga and Palkia. They studied them. They built a spear pillar to observe them, not to pray to them. The ancient faith had become a historical curiosity. The gods were remembered, but they were no longer felt. Unova took that fading memory and turned it into philosophy. The Tao trio weren't creators. They were embodiments of truth and ideals, born from a single dragon that split because of human conflict. The myth wasn't about the origin of the universe. It was about the origin of disagreement. The gods of Unova were mirrors, reflecting the fractures in human nature, and Curum, the empty husk, was the most haunting of all. It was what remained when a god was broken and forgotten. Kalos introduced life and death as divine principles, but it also introduced something new, the ultimate weapon. For the first time, a human had built a machine that could rival the gods. Xerneas and Yveltal were still powerful, but they were no longer the only forces that could reshape the world. Humanity had learned to create its own miracles and its own catastrophes. The divine was no longer necessary, it was optional. Alola pushed back against that trend. The Tapu were not ancient history, they were active guardians, worshipped in the present tense. The people of Alola didn't just tell stories about their gods, they lived with them. They built their society around their blessings and their tests.